Hey guys, welcome to the Another History. Before we begin tonight's journey through history, take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let the world around you fade away. Please subscribe and write a comment below that what time it is where you are right now. We'd love to know where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's slowly travel back in time. Tonight's story begins somewhere in the soft gray hour before sunrise, in a small village pressed between a dark forest and a slow, mist-covered river. A rooster is about to crow for the first time. There is no clock in this village. There is no electric light, no glass in most of the windows. No soft mattress waiting for anyone once the sun climbs the sky. There is only a small house made of woven branches and mud, a low fire banked in ash to keep a single ember alive through the night, and a family of 5 or 6 people curled together under rough wool blankets, breathing slowly in the dark.
Tonight, we are going to slip quietly into that house. We are going to become, just for a little while, a peasant living somewhere in the English countryside, roughly 700 or 800 years ago, a person whose name will never appear in a single history book, whose face was never painted, whose voice was never written down, and whose entire life, from first breath to final one, played out within a few miles of the same muddy lane. We will follow this person and their family from the first gray light of morning through the long turning of the seasons, plowing and planting, haymaking and harvest, feast days and fast days, sickness and birth, the Lord's demands and the church's bells, all the way through to the deep hush of winter nights when the whole world seems to be holding its breath under the snow. There is nothing to do right now but listen, and drift, and let the weight of your own century fall away. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to hold on to a single date or name. Just let your mind wander into the dim, smoky warmth of a medieval cottage, and let the rhythm of an ordinary peasant's ordinary day carry you gently, gently, down into sleep. A village before sunrise. The village has no name that matters to us tonight. Call it, if you like, Hartwell, or Millbrook, or Ashford-under-the-Hill, one of 10,000 nearly identical small clusters of thatched roofs scattered across the English countryside in the 12th or 13th century. It sits, as most villages of this kind sit, along a slow bend of a stream, with a scatter of 30 or 40 households arranged loosely around a green, a church, and the muddy track that passes for a road. Beyond the houses, in every direction, lie the open fields. Great sweeping expanses of land divided not into the neat fenced squares we might picture today, but into long, narrow strips, each strip belonging to a different family, all mixed together like the pieces of an enormous quilt sewn by many careless hands. At this hour, in the deep blue-black stillness before dawn, none of that is visible. The fields are simply darkness stretching outward, darker than the sky, which has just begun, almost imperceptibly, to soften along its eastern edge. An owl somewhere in the wood beyond the fields finishes its last hunting call of the night and falls silent. Somewhere a dog shifts in its sleep and sighs. The whole village breathes in the dark, 30 or 40 households of people and animals, all still wrapped in that particular hush that belongs only to the hour just before first light. Inside the low houses, banked fires glow faint orange under gray blankets of ash, kept alive not by any magic but by careful human hands the night before, hands that raked the coals together and covered them just so, leaving enough breath of oxygen to keep a single coal smoldering until morning, so that a whole household would not have to strike a new flame with flint and steel in the cold dark. Fire, in this world, is not something you simply switch on. Fire is a small, precious, living thing that must be tended, protected, carried carefully from one day into the next, and its loss on a bitter winter night could mean real danger. So the fire sleeps too, banked and quiet, waiting. And so does our family. Inside the cottage. Let your mind settle now into a single house among the 30 or 40. It is small. Perhaps 15 feet by 25, a simple rectangle built from a timber frame filled in with wattle and daub, which is to say a woven lattice of thin branches, hazel or willow, plastered over with a thick mixture of clay, straw, and dung, smoothed by hand and left to dry hard as stone. The roof above is thatch, a deep, heavy layer of straw or reed, sloped steeply so the rain will run off quickly rather than soak through, and inside that thatch, unseen in the darkness, mice have made their homes, and swallows will nest along the eaves once spring returns. There is one room. Perhaps, if this family is a little more prosperous than most, there is a low partition of woven wattle separating a small sleeping area from the main living space, but for most peasant families of this era, the house is simply one open room, and everyone, parents, children, grandparents if they are still living, and very often a few farm animals as well, shares it together. This is not considered strange or uncomfortable. It is simply how a house works. The heat of animal bodies helps keep the whole room warmer through the cold months, and animals kept close at hand are animals less likely to be lost to a wolf or a thief in the night. Along one end of the room, a small partition of wattle fencing, perhaps waist-high, marks off a space for the family's most valuable possessions. An ox, if they are fortunate enough to own a share in one, or more likely a cow, and a few sheep or a pig, tucked into their own corner, chewing quietly on whatever poor forage was saved for them, their warm animal breath rising like fog in the cold air even here, indoors. The smell of this room, if we let ourselves notice it, is thick and complicated. Wood smoke, damp thatch, unwashed wool, the particular Swedish smell of animals, the faint sourness of a floor made of packed earth strewn with rushes or straw that has not been changed in some weeks. It is not the smell of dirtiness exactly, not in the way we might think of it, but simply the smell of a world before soap was a daily habit, before running water, before the countless small conveniences that would, centuries later, come to define what clean even means. In the center of the room, a small fire pit, ringed with stones, holds the banked embers we spoke of a moment ago. There is no chimney, or if there is, it is a very simple opening in the thatch above, or a smoke hole near the peak of the roof, and much of the smoke from the fire simply drifts upward and hangs in a low gray haze under the roof beams before finding its way out. Over centuries, this smoke has blackened the underside of the thatch and the wooden beams to a deep, sooty char, which actually helps preserve the wood and thatch from rot and insects, an accidental kindness of an imperfect system. Around the fire, and along the walls, the family's possessions are few, but not nothing. A rough wooden table, low and sturdy, built by the peasant's own hands or his father's hands before him. A bench or two, or simply stools cut from sections of log. A few wooden bowls and spoons, a couple of iron cooking pots, hard-won and carefully mended when they crack, because iron is expensive and not to be wasted. A large chest, perhaps, holding what cloth and clothing the family owns beyond what they are wearing. Bundles of dried herbs and onions hanging from the beams. A small store of grain in a wooden bin or a woven basket, guarded jealously, because that grain must last not just until the next meal, but until the next harvest, many long months away. And in the corner nearest the fire, where the warmth lingers longest through the night, a low wooden bed frame strung with rope or leather thongs, topped with a mattress stuffed with straw, and on top of that, woolen blankets, and beneath those blankets, the family. The family, sleeping. Picture them now. A man, let's call him what, a common enough name in this world, short for Walter, lies closest to the outer edge of the bed, his body positioned instinctively even in sleep between his family and the door, an old and unconscious habit of protection. He is perhaps 30 years old, though his face, weathered by decades of outdoor labor in sun and wind and rain, might look to our eyes closer to 50. His hands, even at rest, are thick-knuckled and calloused, the hands of a man who has held a plow handle and a scythe and an axe since he was old enough to walk beside his own father in the fields. Beside him is his wife, call her Edith, a few years younger, her hair, unbound now for sleep, spread loose across the straw pillow, though come morning it will be braided tightly and covered, as a married woman's hair always is in public, with a simple linen cloth called a wimple or coverchief. Edith's body, even in rest, carries the marks of a life of constant labor alongside Watts, grinding grain, spinning wool, tending the garden plot, caring for children, brewing what small ale the family can afford, and helping in the fields at the busiest times of the farming year, on top of everything else. Between and around them, their children sleep in a warm tangle of small limbs, perhaps a boy of 8, already old enough to be given real responsibilities, watching the family's few sheep, scaring birds from the newly sown fields, fetching water and firewood. A girl of 5, still young enough to spend her days close to her mother, learning by watching the way children in this world always learn, through imitation rather than instruction. And perhaps, tucked into a small woven cradle near the bed, an infant of a few months old, wrapped tightly in swaddling cloth, whose survival to this point has already been something of a small miracle, given how many infants in this world do not live to see their first birthday. There may be others too. An elderly grandmother, if she is still living, curled on a pallet of straw nearer the fire, where the warmth will ease the ache in her joints. Perhaps an older child who has already begun sleeping separately, closer to the animals, as children grow and the sleeping arrangements shift to make room. This is a full house, in every sense. Privacy, in the way we understand it, does not really exist here. Every birth, every argument, every private moment of grief or tenderness between husband and wife happens within a few feet of children, parents, sometimes grandparents, and almost always animals. And yet within this crowded, smoky, earthy little room, there is also warmth, not only the physical warmth of bodies and banked fire, but the deeper warmth of a family that depends utterly on one another, that has no illusion of independence, that knows, in a way our own century sometimes forgets, that survival is a shared project, not a solitary one. For now, though, none of that matters. For now, they simply sleep, all of them, breathing slowly in the dark, while outside, the sky continues its slow, patient work of turning from black to the deepest, most distant blue. The first sound. It is the rooster that breaks the silence first, as it always does, a ragged, insistent crowing from somewhere near the house next door, answered a moment later by another rooster farther off, and then another, until a whole chorus of roosters is calling across the sleeping village, announcing to anyone still asleep that the night, in fact, is ending, whether they are ready for it or not. What stirs first? He does not leap up. There is no urgency of alarm clocks or schedules to run to in the way we might imagine, but there is a deep, ingrained rhythm in his body, built over 30 years of mornings just like this one, that tells him it is time. He lies still for a moment longer, listening to the roosters, to the faint stirring of the ox in its corner, to his wife's slow breathing beside him, to the particular hush of the world in that last stretch of true dark before the sky begins visibly to lighten. Somewhere outside, very faintly, he can hear the stream that runs past the edge of the village, its water low this time of year, murmuring quietly over stones it has known for longer than any person in this village has been alive. He thinks, as he often does in this quiet moment, of the work ahead. It is spring, let us say, for tonight, that it is a morning in April, some 700 or 800 years ago, and the great work of plowing and sowing the spring fields is well underway. There is a strip of land waiting for him, one among the many long, narrow strips scattered across the village's open fields that belong, by ancient custom and careful record kept in the Lord's own mind or on a scrap of parchment somewhere in the manor house, to Watt and his family. Today, if the weather holds, he means to finish sowing oats on that strip, walking the length of it again and again with a bag of seed slung across his body, casting the grain out across the dark, turned earth with a practiced sweep of his arm. But that is still ahead. First, there is the fire to wake, and the animals to tend, and 100 small tasks that must happen before a single furrow is walked. Watt sits up slowly in the dark, careful not to wake Edith or the children just yet, and swings his legs over the edge of the bed, his bare feet finding the cool, packed earth floor beneath the rushes. And so the day begins, as it begins every day, in every season, for a peasant family in the medieval English countryside, quietly, in darkness, with the smallest of motions, long before the sun itself has decided to show its face. Waking the fire. The first task, always, is the fire. What kneels beside the fire pit and gently rakes back the layer of gray ash that has kept the embers alive through the night. Beneath it, if the banking was done well the evening before, a few coals still glow a deep, dull orange, faint but alive. He leans close and blows on them, softly at first, then with more purpose, watching as the orange deepens and a thin curl of smoke begins to rise. He feeds in a few wisps of dry tinder. Perhaps some shredded bark or dried moss kept specifically for this purpose in a small pouch near the hearth, and the coals catch, a small flame licking up, and he adds thin twigs, then slightly larger ones, building the fire patiently, the way it has been built every single morning of his life and every morning of his father's life before him. This is not a small thing. In a world without matches, without any quick and certain way to conjure fire from nothing, keeping a fire alive through the night, and successfully waking it again each morning, is one of the quiet, unglamorous skills that an entire household's comfort depends upon. If the embers had died overnight, through some accident or oversight, what would need to either strike a spark with flint and steel and iron pyrite into a nest of dry tinder, a task that can take considerable time and patience especially with damp materials, or send one of the children running to a neighbor's house to borrow a burning coal carried carefully in a clay pot or an old broken piece of pottery. Either way, mornings without fire waiting are mornings that start behind, and what, like every peasant in the village, takes quiet pride in the small competence of having kept the flame alive through another night. As the fire grows, warmth begins to spread, gentle and welcome, into the cool morning air of the cottage. The light of the flames flickers against the sooty underside of the thatch roof, against the dark wooden beams, against the sleeping shape still curled in the bed. Edith stirs now, waking to the familiar sound and smell and light of the fire being built, and for a moment she simply lies still, watching her husband's silhouette move against the growing flame, before she, too, begins the work of rising. The animals. While Edith begins to stir the children gently awake, Watt steps to the low wattle partition where the family's animals are kept and lets himself into their small space. There is a soft nickering and shuffling of hooves as the cow, their most valuable possession, in many ways, worth more than the house itself, turns her head toward him, recognizing the sound and shape of the man who tends her every single morning and evening of her life. He checks first that she is well, running a hand along her flank, feeling for any heat or swelling that might signal illness, because the loss of a milk cow would be a genuine catastrophe for this family, not a minor inconvenience but potentially the difference between a hard year and true hunger. Satisfied, he settles onto a low three-legged stool beside her and begins to milk her, his hands moving in the same rhythm they have moved in thousands of times before, the sound of milk hissing into the wooden pail steady and almost musical in the quiet of the early morning. The few sheep, penned in their own corner, bleat softly, hungry and impatient, and what makes a mental note that the eldest boy will need to lead them out to graze on the common pasture once the sun is fully up. A pig. If the family is lucky enough to have one this year, fattening slowly on scraps and foraged acorns toward a slaughter that will come in the autumn, grunts and roots in its own small pen, and what tosses in what little kitchen waste was saved from the night before. This daily tending of animals is not separate from the family's own survival, it is deeply woven into it. The cow's milk will become not just drink but butter and cheese, food that can be stored and traded and eaten through the lean months when fresh food is scarce. The sheep's wool will be sheared in early summer and spun by Edith's hands into thread, woven into the cloth that clothes this entire family. The pig, come autumn, will become meat that must last, carefully salted and smoked, through the long winter ahead. Every animal in this small, crowded corner of the house represents not a pet, not a convenience, but a piece of the family's survival, tended with the same seriousness a person today might tend a bank account or a pantry. Breaking the night's fast. By now, the fire has grown into a steady, warm blaze, and Edith, wrapped in a shawl against the lingering chill, has taken over its management, setting a small iron pot of water to heat and pulling from a wooden bin a portion of coarse dark bread, baked days before. Because most peasant households do not bake bread every day, but rather bake a larger batch every week or two, the bread growing progressively harder and staler as the days pass, until the final loaves are tough enough to require softening in a bit of ale or broth before they can be eaten comfortably. This morning's meal, like most mornings, will be simple, a portion of that dark bread, made from a coarse mixture of grains. Rye, barley, oats, whatever combination the family's own land and the local mill can provide, since fine white wheat bread is a luxury reserved for the wealthy and rarely, if ever, seen on a peasant's table. Alongside the bread, perhaps a bit of cheese, if the family's stores allow it, or a thin gruel made from oats boiled in water or the little milk not needed for other purposes. To drink, small ale. A weak, low-alcohol brew made at home, safer in many ways than the water from the village well or stream, which is not always trustworthy, and a source of some calories and hydration that even the youngest children in the household are given, in small amounts, alongside the adults. There is no long ceremony to this meal. The children, now awake and dressed in their own simple wool and linen garments, gather around the low table, and the family eats quickly, quietly, efficiently, because the day's work is waiting and does not care how long anyone lingers over breakfast. What eats standing, half his mind already out in the fields, running through the work ahead, the strip of land still to be sown, the state of the plow, whether the borrowed ox from a neighbor will be ready as promised. Outside, the sky has continued its slow brightening, and through the single small window, a simple opening in the wattle and daub wall, perhaps covered with a stretched, oiled cloth or a wooden shutter rather than glass, which remains rare and expensive in a peasant home, a pale gray light begins to seep into the room, mixing with the orange glow of the fire. Dressing for the day. The clothing of a peasant family in this era is, like everything else in their world, built for function above all else, made by hand from wool and linen, and mended and remended until a garment is truly beyond saving, at which point its remaining useful cloth will be repurposed into something else entirely, patches, rags, padding, because nothing, in this world of scarcity, is wasted if it can possibly be avoided. What pulls on a simple linen shirt, worn soft and thin from years of washing, and over it a woolen tunic that falls to roughly his knees, belted at the waist with a leather strap from which hangs a small knife, a tool as much as a weapon, essential for 100 daily tasks from cutting bread to trimming rope. His legs are covered with woolen hose, and over his feet, simple leather shoes, soft-soled and low, more like thick leather socks than the sturdy boots we might imagine, though for the muddiest fieldwork he may also wrap his lower legs and feet in strips of cloth or leather for extra protection against wet and cold. Over everything, if the morning air still carries a real chill, a hooded cloak of thick wool, perhaps his one truly warm garment, saved and treasured and passed down when it finally becomes too worn for him to wear himself. Edith dresses in a long linen shift beneath a woolen gown, also belted, with the same practical simplicity, and covers her braided hair with the linen coverchief that marks her, at a glance, to anyone in the village, as a married woman. The children wear smaller versions of the same basic garments, simple, practical, made to be let out or handed down as they grow, patched at the knees and elbows, because a peasant family simply cannot afford to buy or make an entirely new set of clothes every time a child grows an inch. There is no wardrobe of choices here, no question of what to wear today versus tomorrow. Most peasant families of this era own perhaps 2 sets of clothing each. One for everyday wear, one, slightly better kept, for church and feast days, and the daily question of dressing is simply a matter of putting on the same practical garments worn the day before, and the day before that, garments that will, in fact, be worn nearly every single day for years, until they wear through entirely. Stepping outside. Finally, the family steps out through the low doorway of the cottage into the cool, damp air of the early morning, and the wider world of the village opens up around them. The sky above is now a pale, luminous gray-blue, streaked at the eastern horizon with the first warm colors of true sunrise, soft pinks and golds beginning to spread above the dark line of the distant forest. Mist rises in thin, ghostly ribbons from the low, damp ground near the stream, and the whole village, still mostly quiet, is beginning to stir into motion around them. Smoke rising now from a dozen other cottage roofs, the distant lowing of another family's cow, a dog trotting purposefully across the muddy green on some errand only it understands, a neighbor woman already at the village well, drawing water with the practiced, unhurried motion of someone who has done this exact task 10,000 times before. The village green itself is a rough, muddy, trampled expanse of grass and bare earth at the center of the settlement, around which the cottages cluster in no particular geometric order, simply arranged as generations of building and rebuilding have placed them, connected by narrow, winding, thoroughly unpaved paths that turn to genuine mud with every rain. Chickens peck at the ground here and there, geese wander with the particular self-important wattle geese have always possessed, and somewhere a pig has escaped its pen and is being chased, with considerable shouting and laughter, by two boys not much older than What's own son. Rising above all of it, at the heart of the village, stands the church. Likely the single largest and most solidly built structure for miles around, its stone walls, or, in a poorer village, its own timber and wattle construction. Those stone churches were increasingly common by this period even in modest villages, a visible, permanent anchor around which the whole rhythm of village life turns. Its bell, when it rings, for mass, for the hours of prayer, for warnings of fire or danger, for the tolling of a death, is the closest thing this village has to a clock, a shared signal that reaches every household regardless of what strip of land they happen to be working that day. Beyond the houses and the green, beyond the church, the land opens out into the great sweep of the open fields, still shadowed and indistinct in the early light, and it is toward those fields that What's mind, and soon his feet, are already turning, because the strip of oats will not sow itself, and the spring morning, however beautiful, is not going to wait patiently while a peasant lingers over the view. The fields, the furrows, and the first work of the day. Let us walk with What now, out past the last cottage, past the low wooden fence marking the edge of the village's home closes, small enclosed garden plots where cabbages and beans and onions grow close to each house, tended mostly by Edith and the children in whatever spare moments the day allows, and out into the true expanse of the open fields. Picture this landscape clearly, because it is genuinely unlike almost anything in the modern world. There are no hedgerows here, no fences dividing one person's land from another's, no neat rectangular plots. Instead, the entire arable land of the village is divided into 2 or 3 enormous fields. For tonight, let's say this village follows what historians call the 3-field system, one of the great quiet agricultural innovations of the medieval period. One large field is planted this year with a spring crop like oats or barley or peas. A second large field was planted last autumn with a winter crop like wheat or rye, now growing green and steady toward its summer harvest. And a third large field lies fallow this year entirely, resting, being grazed by village livestock whose manure will help restore its fertility for the following season, when the rotation shifts and this field becomes the spring-sown one. Within each of these great fields, the land is subdivided into hundreds of long, narrow strips, typically about 1 furlong long, which is to say, roughly the distance a team of oxen could comfortably plow before needing a rest, and about 1 chain wide, a strip of land historians estimate at roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of an acre. These strips are scattered deliberately across the field rather than gathered together, so that no single family's holdings are entirely concentrated on the best or worst soil, the driest or wettest ground, the land closest to or farthest from the village. It is, in its way, a remarkably fair system for an unfair world, a communal solution to the simple fact that not all land is equally good, arrived at not through any grand design but through generations of practical village custom. What's own strips, he holds perhaps 20 or 30 of them scattered across the 3 great fields, adding up to somewhere between 15 and 30 acres total, a fairly typical holding for a peasant family of moderate standing in this era, require him to walk considerable distances each day simply to move between one piece of his own land and the next. There is no way around this. It is simply the geography of his world, and he has walked these particular paths so many thousands of times that his feet could probably find the way with his eyes closed, in the dark, in the rain, which, on certain miserable mornings of his life, they very nearly have had to do. This morning, his goal is a single strip near the field's northern edge, close by a strip belonging to his neighbor Osbert, with whom he has worked alongside, argued over boundary markers, shared tools, and helped through hard winters for as long as either of them can remember. The soil here has already been plowed in recent days. A deep, dark, damp brown, turned in long straight furrows by a heavy wooden plow pulled by oxen, its curved iron blade cutting deep and turning the earth in a steady, satisfying wave. Today's task is sowing, walking the length of the strip again and again, a woven bag of oat seed slung across his body, casting handfuls of grain outward in a broad, practiced sweep, left hand and right in alternating rhythm, the seed scattering across the freshly turned soil to be harrowed in. Dragged over lightly with a simple wooden frame studded with spikes, or sometimes simply raked by hand or trodden in, later in the day. It is quiet, repetitive, physically demanding work, the kind of labor that fills the hands and legs and back entirely while leaving the mind free to wander, and it is precisely this quality of medieval peasant labor. Endlessly repeated, deeply rhythmic, connected to the turning of seasons that have turned the same way for as long as anyone can remember and will turn the same way for as long as anyone can imagine, that we are going to rest inside of, tonight, as we let this long, slow history carry us gently toward sleep. Osbert arrives. As what begins his work, he is not entirely alone. Farming in this world, despite the family-by-family division of the strips, is deeply, unavoidably communal. Osbert, working his own neighboring strip, calls out a greeting across the low earth ridge, the unplowed grass bulk, that marks the boundary between their lands, and the two men fall into the easy, familiar conversation of people who have known each other their entire lives. The weather, the state of the soil, a shared worry about whether the spring rains have come early enough or late enough this year, a bit of village gossip about whose daughter is soon to be married, whose cow seems to be favoring one leg, whether the miller's latest toll on their grain seems fair or, as is more commonly grumbled, a little too generous to the miller himself. This casual daily conversation, happening across furrows and boundary strips all across the great open fields on any given morning, is one of the quiet threads that binds an entire village together into something more than just 30 or 40 separate households. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone's business is, in some sense, everyone's business. There is very little privacy in this world, but there is also, as a direct consequence, very little true isolation. A trade that this history will return to more than once as we go, because it shapes nearly everything about how peasants like Wat and Edith understand their place in the world. Farther off across the great field, other families are at other tasks, a woman driving a small flock of geese out to graze the fallow field, an old man mending a section of fence around the common pasture where the village's animals graze together under a communal herdsman's watch, a group of children, including, before long, Wat and Edith's own eldest boy. Herding sheep out toward the same common land, chattering and occasionally chasing one another between their assigned duties, because even in a world of hard labor and real responsibility, children remain children, and play finds its way into the cracks of even the busiest days. The shadow of the manor. And yet, even on a morning as peaceful and ordinary as this one, Wat's labor is never entirely his own, and it is worth pausing here, gently, to understand why. Because this single fact shapes nearly everything about the medieval peasant's world, and we will return to it many times across the parts of this history still to come. Wat is not, in the fullest sense, a free man in the way we might understand that term today. He is what history calls a villain, a peasant bound by long custom and law to a particular manor, held by a particular lord. In this case, a knight named, let us say, Sir Robert de Clare, who himself holds this land in turn from a still greater lord, who holds it from the king, in a great cascading chain of obligation that historians call the feudal system, though the people living inside it in this era would likely never have used so tidy a word for the complicated, inherited, deeply unequal arrangement of their world. In exchange for the strips of land he farms. Land which is not, strictly speaking, his own property to sell or leave as he wishes, but land held under the customs of the manor. What owes Sir Robert several kinds of obligation. He owes labor. A certain number of days each week, often 2 or 3, working not his own strips but the lord's own domain land, the private fields reserved for the lord's direct profit, plowing and sowing and harvesting there under the direction of the Lord's bailiff or reeve, a fellow villager appointed to oversee such work, before he is permitted to turn to his own family's strips. He owes a portion of his own harvest, paid in grain or occasionally in coin, as a kind of rent. He owes fees at particular moments of his family's life, a payment when his daughter marries, a payment when he himself dies and his eldest son inherits the family's holding, a fee simply to have his own grain ground at the Lord's mill rather than attempting, illegally, to grind it himself at home. And beyond even Sir Robert, he owes the church its own portion, the tithe, a tenth of his produce, given each year to support the local priest and the wider church. None of this is experienced by what, this morning, as some dramatic burden weighing constantly on his mind. It is simply the shape of his world, as unquestioned and unremarkable to him as the shape of the sky. He was born into this arrangement, as his father was before him, and his own son, sleeping soundly in the cottage behind him even now, will very likely inherit this same strip of land, these same obligations, this same particular relationship to Sir Robert's family, when Wat himself eventually dies. There is, in this world, very little sense of individual choice about one's station in life. One is born a peasant, or a knight, or a lord, or a priest, and the medieval mind, shaped by centuries of teaching from the church itself, generally understands this arrangement not as an injustice to be questioned but as the natural, divinely ordained order of things, each person occupying the place God intended for them, each place essential to the functioning of the whole. We will spend more time, in later parts of this long, slow history, exploring exactly what those labor obligations look like in practice, the days spent working the Lord's fields, the encounters with the manor court, the small negotiations and quiet resistances by which peasants across medieval Europe found whatever narrow room they could for their own interests within a system stacked heavily against them. But for tonight, as the morning brightens into full daylight and Wat continues his slow, steady work of sowing oats along his own strip of earth, it is enough simply to feel the shape of this world settle around us, a world of deep obligation and deep community, of hard labor and unquestioned hierarchy, of small joys carved carefully out of long, difficult days. The harrow and the birds. Once Wat has finished casting seed across the length of his strip, walking the row perhaps 6 or 8 times over, back and forth, his bag growing lighter with each pass, the next task is to work the seed down into the soil, so that it will take root rather than simply sit exposed on the surface, easy prey for the crows and rooks that have already begun gathering along the field's edge, watching the whole operation with the patient, beady-eyed interest of birds who have done this particular dance with peasant farmers every spring of their own lives. For this, Wat has brought a harrow, a simple, heavy wooden frame, roughly square, its underside studded with wooden or iron spikes, dragged across the sown ground to break up the surface and cover the scattered seed. In a wealthier household, this harrow might be pulled by a horse or a second ox, but Wat's family owns no horse, and his single ox is shared, by long-standing arrangement, with 2 other families in the village, each taking their turn with the animal on different days of the plowing and sowing season. Today, lacking the ox's help for this particular task, Wat instead ties a length of rope to the harrow and pulls it himself, leaning his whole body into the effort, his boots, or rather his simple leather shoes, sinking slightly into the soft, freshly turned earth with every step. It is hard, grinding, monotonous work, the kind that makes a person's shoulders and lower back ache by mid-morning, and Wat pauses more than once to straighten up, press a hand into the small of his back, and look out over the field, watching his own progress against the great unfinished length of the strip still waiting ahead of him. Nearby, his son, sent out to the fields for a time before his sheep-watching duties on the common begin in earnest, has been given the task of scaring off the crows, running along the edge of the sown ground with a wooden clapper, a simple noise-making device of 2 flat boards joined by a leather hinge, snapping it loudly and shouting to send the birds wheeling up into the pale morning sky in a great startled black cloud, only to circle back and settle a little farther off, waiting for their moment. This scene. A boy chasing crows with a wooden clapper across a freshly sown field, while his father drags a harrow behind him and the birds wheel and settle, in an endless patient negotiation between hungry birds and hopeful farmers, has played out across the English countryside, in one form or another, for so many centuries that it feels less like a single morning and more like a fragment of something eternal, repeated without real variation from what's grandfather's youth to what's own son's youth, and very likely, though none of them could know it, for centuries still to come after them. Mid-morning, the village comes fully awake. By the time the sun has climbed well above the tree-line, the whole village has shifted from the hushed stirring of dawn into the full, busy hum of a working morning. Sound carries easily across the open fields on a still spring day, and if we let ourselves simply listen for a moment, we can hear the whole scattered orchestra of village life at work, the rhythmic thud of an axe somewhere near the edge of the wood, where a man is cutting and splitting firewood for his household's needs. The higher, lighter ring of a hammer on iron from the direction of the village smithy, where the blacksmith, one of the very few specialized craftsmen this small village supports directly, is repairing a plow blade or shaping a new set of nails, the lowing of cattle being driven out to the common pasture, the calling back and forth of women at the well, drawing water in wooden buckets and exchanging the morning's small news. Not every household in the village is occupied purely with fieldwork, even during the busy planting season. A village of this size typically supports a small handful of part-time specialists alongside its farming families, perhaps the blacksmith we just heard, who also farms his own strips of land in whatever hours the forge allows, a miller, who operates the water-powered or wind-powered mill that grinds the village's grain into flour, taking his toll, a portion of the flour itself. As payment, a toll that is a near-constant source of muttered village complaint, fair or not, perhaps a carpenter or wheelwright, skilled at building and repairing the wooden tools, carts, and structures the whole community depends on. These craftspeople occupy a slightly different position in village life than a purely farming family like Watts. A little more specialized, sometimes a little more prosperous, though rarely wealthy in any way we would recognize, and just as bound to the customs and obligations of the manor as anyone else. The priest, too, is stirring by this hour, having likely already said the earliest mass of the day in the small stone church at the village's heart, attended by whichever handful of villagers, often the elderly, or those between other tasks, could spare the time this particular morning. The church, as we touched on briefly before, is not merely a building for Sunday worship in this world, it is the deep organizing rhythm beneath the entire village's sense of time itself. The bells mark the canonical hours, not with the mechanical precision of a clock, but with a steady, familiar pulse that shapes when a peasant might pause briefly in the fields, cross himself, and murmur a quick prayer before returning to his work. The soil beneath their feet. Let us pause here, in the midst of all this activity, and think for a moment about the soil itself. Because in a very real sense, the soil is the true, silent center of this entire world, more important, in its own quiet way, than any lord or king, because it is the soil, and the soil alone, that determines whether this village eats well or eats poorly in the year ahead, whether children grow strong or grow thin and sickly, whether the winter to come is one of quiet sufficiency or genuine, gnawing hunger. Watt, like every peasant farmer of his era, possesses a deep, hard-won, entirely practical knowledge of his own local soil that no book could have taught him and that he himself could likely not have explained in any abstract terms, because it was never taught to him as abstract knowledge at all. It was simply absorbed, year by year, furrow by furrow, from childhood spent trailing behind his own father's plow, watching, imitating, gradually taking on more and more of the work himself until, somewhere in his late teenage years, the knowledge had become simply a part of him, inseparable from the muscles of his own arms and the calluses of his own hands. He knows, without needing to articulate it in any formal way, that the strip near the stream holds moisture longer into a dry summer, useful in some years and a liability in others when the spring is already wet. He knows that the strip on the higher ground drains faster but tires more quickly, giving a good yield for a year or two after being manured but falling off sooner than the richer, lower ground. He knows, from the particular color and texture of the earth turned up by his plow this very morning, roughly what kind of year it is likely to be, whether the soil feels right, workable, full of the particular crumbling richness that promises a good crop, or whether it feels heavy and cold and reluctant in a way that makes his stomach tighten with a familiar, wordless worry. This deep, practical, generations accumulated knowledge of soil and season and weather is, in truth, one of the great overlooked intellectual achievements of the medieval peasant world, an entire sophisticated body of agricultural understanding, refined over centuries of trial and careful observation, passed down not through writing, which almost none of these farmers could do, but through the oldest and most durable form of human knowledge transfer there is. A father teaching a son, a mother teaching a daughter, hands guiding hands, season after season after season, until the knowledge is no longer separate from the person at all, but simply part of who they are. Tools of the trade. It's worth taking a slow, quiet moment here, too, to consider the tools themselves. Because in a world without engines, without any power beyond human muscle and animal strength and, very occasionally, water or wind, the tools a peasant family owns represent both an enormous portion of their total wealth and the entire limit of what they are physically capable of accomplishing in a day. The plow is the single most important and most valuable tool most peasant households will ever own, or, quite often, own a share in jointly with neighbors, because a full plow team and plow together represent an investment well beyond what most individual families could afford alone. The heavy wooden plow of this era, what historians sometimes call a moldboard plow, is a genuinely clever piece of engineering for its time. A curved wooden or iron blade that not only cuts into the soil but turns it over as it goes, burying weeds and grass and creating the long dark furrows we pictured earlier. Pulled by oxen, typically a team of 2, 4, or even 8 animals for the heaviest clay soils, it requires not only the animals themselves but a skilled hand to guide it, keeping the furrows straight and even, a skill that, like knowledge of the soil, takes years to properly develop. Beyond the plow, a peasant household's tools are largely simple, hand-powered implements, the harrow we already met, dragging seed into the soil, scythes and sickles for the harvest still months away, wooden rakes and hand tools for the garden plot, an axe for firewood and building, a simple wooden cart, if the family is fortunate enough to own one, for hauling grain and manure and firewood along the muddy village lanes. Nearly everything is made of wood, shaped by hand or by the village carpenter, with iron reserved carefully for the parts that truly require its strength and edge, plow blades, axe heads, knife blades, the occasional set of nails, because iron itself must be purchased, at real cost, from the blacksmith, who in turn must purchase raw iron from traders who bring it from mines and forges some distance beyond the village itself. A peasant family's entire material world, in other words, is built from a relatively small set of hand tools, patiently maintained, endlessly repaired, and handed down from one generation to the next as genuinely valuable inheritance, alongside the land itself. There is no casual replacing of a broken tool with a quick trip to a shop. A cracked plow blade, a broken axe handle, a worn-through scythe blade. Each represents real cost, real inconvenience, and often real delay in work that cannot simply wait for a convenient moment, because the seasons themselves do not wait, and a field not sown in time, or a harvest not gathered before the autumn rains, can mean the difference between a family's comfortable survival and a winter of genuine want. Weather watching. And so, naturally, weather sits at the very center of a peasant's daily attention, in a way that is difficult for those of us living in a world of heated homes, waterproof roads, and grocery stores stocked regardless of the season to fully appreciate. What, standing now at the edge of his newly sown and harrowed strip, glances up at the sky the way he has glanced up at the sky every single morning of his working life, reading it with the same practiced, wordless fluency he brings to the soil. A high, thin scatter of cloud drifting from the west this morning suggests, in the accumulated weather wisdom of this village, a fair day ahead, good for finishing the sowing before any rain returns to soften the ground too much for the harrow to do its work properly. The wind, light and cool out of the northwest, carries the particular clean, damp smell of the distant hills rather than the heavier, wetter smell that, in what's long experience, tends to arrive on a southwesterly wind ahead of several days of steady rain. None of this is superstition exactly, though there is certainly some folk wisdom and half-remembered proverb mixed in as well. Much of it is simply the same kind of accumulated practical observation that shapes his knowledge of the soil, built from a lifetime of paying very close attention to a natural world that his family's survival depends upon, quite literally, from one season to the next. A bad year. A spring too wet for proper plowing and sowing, a summer too dry for the grain to fill out properly, an early frost catching the harvest before it can be gathered, a season of storms flattening standing grain into the mud, is not, in this world, a minor inconvenience or an interesting topic for small talk. A single bad harvest can mean real hunger through the following winter and spring. 2 bad harvests in a row, which does happen, with grim regularity, across the long medieval centuries, can mean genuine famine, sickness, and death across an entire region, peasant and lord alike, though naturally the peasant, with far less stored reserve to fall back on, suffers first and worst. Every glance what gives to the sky this morning, every careful reading of wind and cloud, carries within it this deeper, quieter weight. A farmer's constant, low-level awareness that his family's survival rests, in the end, on forces entirely beyond his control, forces he can only watch, and read, and prepare for as best his accumulated knowledge allows. The common land. Beyond the great open fields of strips, there is one more piece of this landscape worth resting in for a moment, because it represents something genuinely different from the individually held strips we have spent most of this first part exploring. The common land. Every village of this kind holds, alongside its plowed fields, a stretch of land, pasture, meadow, sometimes rough woodland, that belongs to no single family, but to the community as a whole, governed by long-established custom about who may graze how many animals there, who may gather firewood or nuts or berries, who may cut hay from the common meadow and in what order. This morning, as the sun climbs higher, it is toward this common pasture that Wat and Edith's eldest boy leads the family's small flock of sheep, alongside other children and a few adults doing the same with their own animals, all of them gathering, in effect, into a single mixed herd that will graze together under the loose supervision of a village herdsman, often an older man or a capable older child, appointed by common agreement to watch over the whole flock for the day. This system of shared common land is, in its way, one of the most quietly remarkable features of the medieval peasant world, a genuinely cooperative solution to the basic problem that most individual peasant families, however hard-working, simply do not own enough animals or enough land to justify each family maintaining its own separate pasture and its own dedicated herdsman. By pooling their grazing land and their labor of watching over the animals, the whole village accomplishes together something none of them could easily manage alone. The same cooperative spirit extends to the common meadow, whose hay, vital winter fodder for the animals that will otherwise struggle to survive the cold months, is often divided among families each year by a system of lots or rotation, ensuring that no single family always gets the best or worst portion of the harvest. It's worth sitting with this for a moment, because it complicates any picture of the medieval peasant as simply an isolated, struggling individual battling alone against a hard world. In truth, Wat's survival, and Edith's, and their children's, depends every single day on a dense, overlapping web of shared labor, shared land, shared tools, shared knowledge, and shared custom that binds the whole village together into something closer to a single extended, cooperative organism than a simple collection of separate households. The Lord above them extracts labor and rent, certainly, and the church above that extracts its tithe, and the whole structure is, by any modern standard, deeply unequal, but within the village itself, among the peasants themselves, there runs a genuine, practical solidarity, born not of any abstract ideal but of the simple hard fact that no single family, in this world, could hope to survive entirely alone. Toward midday. The sun climbs steadily now toward its highest point, and the shadows across the great open fields shorten with it. Wat has finished harrowing his strip of sown oats, and stands for a moment at its edge, looking back over the long, dark, freshly worked earth with the particular quiet satisfaction of a task completed. Not finished, not really, because there is always more work waiting, but this piece of it, this one strip, sown and covered and given over now to the patient, invisible work of the seed itself, swelling underground, sending down its first pale roots into the dark earth, beginning the slow months-long transformation from scattered grain to standing crop to, eventually, if the weather holds and the harvest comes in well, bread on his family's table through the following winter. Across the field, Osbert straightens from his own work and calls out that it must be close to midday, judging by the sun and by the particular hollow feeling that has been growing in both their stomachs for the better part of an hour now. Somewhere back toward the village, the church bell begins to ring, marking the office of sext, the midday hour of prayer, and though neither Wat nor Osbert will pause their work for any formal observance out here in the fields, the sound of the bell serves the same practical purpose it always serves in this world. A shared signal, reaching every strip and pasture and workshop across the village at once, that the morning's work is drawing to its natural close, and that somewhere back among the low thatched roofs, a simple midday meal is likely already being prepared. It is here, with the bell still fading across the fields and the whole village pausing, for a little while, in the warm hush of a spring midday, that we will let this first part of our long, slow history rest. Let your own mind rest here too, if it wants to, in the quiet space between morning's labor and midday's meal, in the particular stillness of a field freshly sown, in the simple, ancient satisfaction of a task well begun on an ordinary spring morning, centuries and centuries ago, in a small village whose name has long since been forgotten, but whose rhythms, waking the fire, tending the animals, walking the furrows, reading the sky, echo on, patiently, gently, into the deep and welcoming dark of sleep. End of Part 1. Part 2 continues with the midday meal, the work of the women and children, the village craftspeople, and the slow arc of the afternoon toward evening. Asterisk. Returning to the village. Let yourself settle again into that same soft, drifting stillness, the one we found together in Part 1. Standing at the edge of a freshly harrowed strip of oats, listening to a church bell fade slowly across the fields. At midday. If you are joining us now for the first time, that is perfectly fine, you need remember nothing at all. Simply let your body grow heavy, let your breath grow slow, and let your mind sink gently into a small English village, some 700 or 800 years gone, where a man named Wat has just finished sowing his spring oats, and a bell is calling the whole scattered work of the morning quietly back toward home. There is nothing to do now but listen, and drift, and follow the day as it continues to turn, from the busy hush of the fields toward the warmer, closer hush of the cottage at midday, and from there onward, slowly, unhurriedly, into the long gold stretch of a medieval afternoon. You do not need to hold on to anything. Just let the rhythm of this old, forgotten day carry you, the way a slow river carries a fallen leaf, without effort, without direction of its own, simply downstream, and down, toward sleep. The walk home. Wat straightens his back one final time, wipes his hands on the rough wool of his tunic, and slings the empty seed bag over his shoulder. Across the strip, Osbert is doing the same, and the two men fall into step together. Along the narrow grass balk that separates one family's land from the next, the ancient unplowed strip of turf that marks a boundary no one in the village would ever think to argue about, because it has marked that same boundary for longer than either of their grandfathers could remember. They do not hurry. There is no reason to hurry, not really. The whole rhythm of a peasant's working day moves at the pace of the body and the season, not at the pace of a clock, and a slow, steady walk home after a long morning's labor is itself a kind of quiet reward, a chance to let tired shoulders loosen, to feel the sun, now fully risen and warm on the back of the neck, to notice, almost without noticing, the small green stirrings of the hedgerow beside the path, new leaves unfurling on the hawthorn, the first white stars of blackthorn blossom, a lark somewhere impossibly high overhead, pouring out its endless spring song into the pale blue. Nothing above the fields. The family eats together, seated on the rough bench and stools around the low table, or simply on the floor. Near the fire, each person with a wooden bowl and spoon, dipping torn pieces of the dark bread into the pottage, eating without particular ceremony but also without particular haste. There is a kind of unhurried gravity to a meal in this world that is easy for us, in our own century of rushed lunches eaten standing at a counter, to lose sight of. This is not simply refueling before returning to work, though it is certainly that too. but one of the very few moments in the entire long day when the whole family gathers together in one place. At rest, for its own sake. The boy, let us give him a name now, since he will walk with us through much of this afternoon, call him Robin, a common enough name among village boys of this era, eats quickly, the particular fast. Unself-conscious eating of an 8-year-old with an appetite built by a whole morning spent chasing crows across a muddy field. The girl, whom we might call Mary, sits closer to her mother, still small enough that Edith breaks her bread into smaller pieces for her without either of them thinking much about it, an old, wordless habit repeated 1,000 times over. The infant sleeps, for now, in the woven cradle near the fire, and the whole small room, filled with the smell of pottage and wood smoke and the low murmur of a family's midday talk, holds, for these few quiet minutes, something very close to contentment. What grows in the pot? Let us linger a moment longer over that simmering pot, because it holds within it, in its own quiet way, almost the entire economy and ecology of this small village, compressed down into a single, humble, everyday meal. The peas and beans that thickened today's pottage were grown, very likely, on a strip not far from the one what sowed with oats this very morning, part of the careful, ancient rotation of crops that keeps this open field system productive year after year without the modern conveniences of chemical fertilizer or imported nutrients. Legumes such as peas and beans, though no medieval farmer could have explained the underlying chemistry, have a way of enriching soil that has been exhausted by a season or two of grain, a fact known to what and every farmer like him not as science but as simple, tested custom, passed down the same way as everything else. This field grew poorly in beans last year after 2 years of wheat, so this year we rest it, or turn it to peas, or let the village's animals graze and manure it a while. The village, as they approach it, has the particular soft, lived-in look of a place fully awake and fully at work. Smoke rises in thin gray threads from a dozen low roofs. A dog trots across the muddy green with the unhurried purpose of a dog on some errand only it understands. Somewhere, a child laughs, and somewhere else, a goose scolds someone loudly for some offense only the goose understands either. This is the sound of a village at midday. Not silence, and not the sharp bustle of a market town, but a low, steady, contented hum of a community doing exactly what it has always done, at exactly the hour it has always done it. The midday meal. Inside the cottage, Edith has been busy for hours already, though her morning's work has looked nothing at all like Watts. While he walked the fields with his seed bag, she has moved through a dozen different tasks within and around the house, and now, as the bell fades and the shadows shorten toward noon, she kneels by the fire, feeding a few dry sticks into the banked embers to coax up a proper cooking flame, and swings the iron pot, hung from a simple hook or pivoting iron arm called a crane, over the growing heat. The meal that awaits Watt and the children this midday is, in almost every peasant household across the English countryside, some form of the same humble, endlessly variable dish, pottage. It is less a single recipe than an entire category of cooking, built around whatever the household has on hand, dried peas or beans soaked the night before, perhaps a handful of barley or oats, whatever greens the garden plot offers this. Early in the spring, an onion or two, a bit of salt if the family can spare it, and, on a fortunate day, a small piece of bacon or salted pork for flavor, though meat of any kind remains, for most peasant families, a genuine luxury rather than a daily expectation. All of it goes into the pot together with water, and simmers, slowly, for hours, filling the smoky air of the cottage with a warm, thick, faintly earthy smell that is, to every child raised in this world, simply the smell of home itself. Alongside the pottage sits bread, dark, dense, chewy bread made from a coarse mixture of grains, most Often rye or barley rather than the finer white wheat bread reserved almost entirely for the Lord's own table. Baked not in this cottage but very likely in the village's communal oven, one more shared resource, like the common pasture, that binds the households of this small place together. Many villages of this era do not permit individual households to keep their own ovens at all, insisting instead that all baking pass through the Lord's oven, for a fee, one more small, steady toll extracted from the peasant's daily bread, quite literally. Though the practical benefit of a shared, well-tended oven, less likely to burn down a crowded row of thatched cottages than dozens of separate small hearths, is real enough too. The grain itself, whatever mix of oats, barley, or rye finds its way into the pot alongside the peas, represents the single most precious and most closely guarded resource in this entire household's possession, more valuable, in its way, than any other single thing the family owns apart from the land itself. It must be portioned out with real care across the long months between one harvest and the next, must survive the constant threat of damp and mice and mold in its storage bin, and must, above everything else, be balanced against the portion that will be set aside as seed grain for next year's sowing, because a family desperate enough, in a hard winter, to eat its own seed grain rather than starve has mortgaged its entire following year's harvest to survive the present one, a genuinely desperate last resort that every peasant family understands, with real dread, as one of the darkest possible turns their fortune could take. And then there is what the pot does not contain, quite as often as we might assume. Meat, as we touched on already, is a genuine luxury in most peasant households across most of the year, not because peasants dislike meat, far from it, but because livestock represents wealth in a form too valuable to casually consume. A cow gives milk, year after year, and eventually calves that can be raised or sold. A pig, more readily slaughtered than a cow, is still most often saved for the autumn, when the family's stores of grain to feed it through another winter run thin, and a single pig, carefully salted and smoked, can provide meat in careful small portions stretched across many weeks of the cold months ahead. A hen is worth more, in the long run, for the eggs she lays week after week than for the single meal she would provide on the table. And so the pottage pot, day after day, holds mostly grain and vegetable and water, with meat appearing only occasionally. A feast day, a special occasion, a lucky catch of fish from the stream, or simply a day when an old hen has finally stopped laying and outlived her usefulness. Edith's morning, unseen. It is worth pausing here, before the meal is finished and the afternoon's work begins again, to look backward for a moment over the morning that Edith herself has just lived through, a morning that unfolded almost entirely out of sight of the fields where we spent part one, and yet was no less full, no less demanding, and, in its own way, no less essential to the survival of this family than anything what accomplished with his plow and harrow. Edith rose before what did, in the deep dark before the roosters, as peasant wives across this whole world so often did, because the fire that what woke to a gentle glow in part one did not tend itself, and the thin gruel or watered ale that broke the family's fast at first light did not prepare itself either. While What and the other men walked out to the fields, Edith's own working day unfolded within a tight, demanding radius around the cottage. Milking the family's cow, if they are fortunate enough to keep one, in the cool gray hour just after dawn, feeding the hens scattered feed and checking the small woven baskets tucked into corners of the house or the low lean-to attached to its side for whatever eggs the hens have laid overnight, tending the small garden plot, called a toft, that sits behind or beside most peasant cottages, where cabbages, onions, leeks, beans, and herbs grow in close, carefully weeded rows, providing the vegetables that will flavor tonight's pottage and, in a good year, a modest surplus to trade or sell. Beyond the animals and the garden, there is the work of cloth, an entire vast, largely invisible economy of spinning and weaving that occupied a truly enormous share of a peasant woman's waking hours across the whole medieval period, so much so that the very word spinster, which we still use today, comes directly from this constant, ever-present labor. In whatever scattered minutes the day allows, while watching a pot, while minding a child, while walking to fetch water, Edith's hands are very often occupied with a drop spindle, twisting raw wool, sheared from the family's own sheep or purchased in small quantities from a neighbor, into the long, even thread that will eventually, after countless more hours of labor at a simple wooden loom through the winter months, become the rough woolen cloth that clothes this entire family, year after year, coat and blanket and swaddling cloth alike. And beneath all of this, running through every hour of Edith's day like a steady undercurrent, is the ceaseless, half-conscious labor of childcare, an infant who must be fed and comforted and watched, a 5-year-old who must be kept near enough to teach and far enough from the fire and the animals to stay safe, an 8-year-old whose energy and growing independence bring their own particular demands. There is no separate category, in this world, called childcare, set apart from the rest of a day's labor, the way our own century sometimes imagines it. It is simply woven into everything else, inseparable from the milking and the spinning and the garden weeding, a constant low hum of watchfulness beneath every other task. The well and the society of women. Somewhere in the middle of this long, scattered morning, Edith has almost certainly made her way, as she does most days, to the village well or the nearby stream, a wooden yoke across her shoulders balancing two heavy buckets, to fetch the water that this household, like every household in the village, needs constantly. And in real quantity, for cooking, for the animals, for the endless work of washing wool and, less frequently than we might imagine, washing bodies and clothes. This trip, repeated daily by every woman and older girl in the village, has become, over generations, something considerably more than a simple chore. The well or the stream bank functions, in a village like this, as one of the very few genuinely public gathering places available to peasant women, whose lives are otherwise structured so heavily around the household and its immediate surroundings. Here, filling buckets side by side, women exchange the true daily currency of village life. Who is sick and needs a remedy or a visit? Whose cow has taken poorly and might need watching? Which family's daughter has caught the eye of which family's son, and whether the match seems a wise one, what the priest said in his sermon last Sunday, and what everyone privately thought of it, whether the Lord's bailiff has been asking pointed questions again about unpaid dues. This is not idle gossip in any dismissive sense, though it is certainly gossip in the warmest, most human sense of that word. In a world without letters, without any wider news beyond what a traveling peddler or a returning pilgrim might occasionally bring, this daily exchange of small, local, intensely relevant information is one of the primary ways an entire community stays genuinely connected to itself, how it monitors its own well-being, passes down its accumulated folk knowledge of healing herbs and remedies, negotiates its social bonds and its occasional disputes, and simply reminds itself, day after day, that it is in fact a community, and not merely a scattered collection of separate households each struggling alone. Simple healing. Woven into Edith's long day, too, though we have not yet spoken of it directly, is a kind of quiet, essential knowledge that every peasant woman of this era carries, whether she thinks of it as a skill or simply as part of being a mother and a wife, the knowledge of simple healing. There is no physician within easy reach of this village, and even if there were, his services, trained, as physicians of this era often were, in a learned tradition drawn from ancient Greek and Roman medicine, filtered through Arabic scholarship and centuries of careful, if often mistaken, theorizing about the bodies. For humors, would be far beyond what a peasant family could ever hope to afford. Instead, the health of this household, in all its ordinary daily forms, rests very largely in Edith's own hands, and in the accumulated folk knowledge passed down to her from her own mother, and from the other women of the village, gathered in those same daily conversations at the well we spoke of a moment ago. A wound is cleaned and bound with clean linen, perhaps packed with cobwebs, which folk practice across much of medieval Europe held to help stop bleeding, or dressed with a poultice of crushed herbs from the garden, plantain, perhaps, or yarrow, both genuinely useful for minor wounds in ways that later science would come to explain, even if Edith herself understands their use only through the accumulated, tested wisdom of generations rather than through any formal chemistry. A fever is treated with rest, with simple broths, with cooling cloths, and very often with a whispered prayer or a small charm alongside the practical remedy, because in this world, illness of the body and the spiritual world beyond it are never entirely separate concerns. A fever might be eased by yarrow tea, certainly, but it might also be helped along by a quiet prayer to a particular saint known, by long local tradition, to take a special interest in matters of health and healing. Childbirth itself, one of the most dangerous events any woman in this world will ever face, unfolds almost entirely within this same female world of accumulated practical knowledge, attended not by any physician, but by a midwife, very often simply an older, experienced village woman who has attended many births over many years, assisted by other women of the household and neighborhood, while men, including the woman's own husband, wait outside, sometimes for many long hours, sometimes, tragically, for a birth that ends in grief rather than joy. The infant sleeping now in the cradle by Watt and Edith's fire is, as we noted in Part 1, something of a small miracle simply by having survived this far, in a world where a meaningful share of infants do not live to see their first birthday, and where childbirth itself claims the lives of a real and painful number of mothers as well. This shadow, this constant awareness of how fragile life can be at its very beginning, sits quietly beneath the surface of even the most ordinary, contented days in a household like Watt and Edith's, not spoken of constantly, but never entirely forgotten either. The world of the children. While Edith carries her water and Watt and Osbert make their unhurried way home for the midday meal, it is worth turning our attention, for a little while, to the children themselves. Because childhood, in this world, looks so different from anything our own century would recognize that it is easy to misunderstand it entirely, either by imagining it as needlessly cruel or by romanticizing it into something it was not. There is, in medieval peasant life, no real concept of childhood as a long, protected, separate stage of life, devoted primarily to play and formal learning, the way our own century has come to understand it. A child in Robin's position, at 8 years old, is already a genuine contributor to the household economy, and has been, in smaller ways, for several years already. By 4 or 5, a child is expected to help with simple tasks. Fetching small objects, watching a younger sibling, scaring birds from a garden plot close to home. By 6 or 7, real responsibilities begin, watching the family's animals, gathering firewood and kindling, running errands between households. By 8, as we saw in Part 1, a boy like Robin might already be trusted with the family's sheep out on the common pasture, a genuinely important responsibility, since a lost or wolf taken sheep represents a real, painful loss to a family with very little margin for such losses. And yet, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, none of this means that childhood in this world was without warmth, or play, or genuine joy. Children in medieval villages had games, many of them recognizable even to us, simple ball games, tag, hide-and-seek among the farm buildings and hedgerows, games played With knucklebones or simple carved wooden toys, mock combats with sticks standing in for swords, dolls made of cloth and straw for the younger girls. Play, in this world, was not scheduled or separated from work. The way we might expect, rather, it was woven into the working day itself, so that a boy watching sheep on the common might spend long stretches of the afternoon in genuine, unsupervised play with the other children, doing the same task alongside him, the flock grazing peacefully nearby requiring only occasional, half-conscious attention. Learning, too, looked entirely different from formal schooling. There were no schools for children like Robin and Mary. Formal education of that kind, where it existed at all in medieval England, was reserved almost entirely for the sons of the wealthy, or for boys destined for the church. Instead, children learned the way children in nearly every pre-modern society have learned throughout most of human history, through close, constant, patient imitation. Mary, at 5, spends her days near Edith, watching her spin, watching her cook, watching her tend the garden, gradually being given small real tasks of her own, stirring a pot under close supervision, fetching a specific herb from the garden, holding a spindle for the first clumsy time, until, by slow degrees over years, imitation becomes genuine competence. Robin learns the same way from what, not through any formal lesson in plowing or sewing, but through years of simply being present, first watching, then helping in small ways, then gradually taking on more and more of the real work himself, until one day, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, he will simply be a man who knows how to farm. Because he has, in truth, been learning it his entire life. The village trades. As the afternoon settles in and what, Osbert, and the other men of the village make ready to return to their fields, let us wander, for a little while, away from one's own household and toward the small handful of specialized craftspeople whose work threads through every other family's life in this village, and whom we glimpsed only briefly in part 1. Foremost among them, in most villages of this kind, is the blacksmith, a figure of genuine, if modest, importance in a world where iron is scarce, expensive, and essential. The blacksmith's forge sits usually a little apart from the other cottages, both for practical reasons of fire safety and because the work itself, with its roaring charcoal fire and ringing hammer blows, simply demands more space and more separation than an ordinary household's daily life. Here, the smith repairs plow blades worn thin by a season of cutting through heavy clay soil, shapes new nails and hinges and simple tools, mends broken chains and iron pothooks, and, when called upon, shoes the lord's horses or repairs the ironwork of the manor house itself, work that sits somewhat outside the ordinary village economy, paid for directly by the lord rather than through the customary exchanges of goods and labor that govern most transactions between peasant households. The miller occupies an equally essential, though rather more resented, position in village life. Nearly every village of any size depends on a single mill, powered by the flow of the nearby stream, or in some regions by the wind itself, to grind the grain that every household survival ultimately depends on, since whole grain, however carefully stored, is of little use until it has been ground into flour fine enough for bread and pottage alike. The miller's toll, taken as a portion of the flour itself in exchange for this essential service, is one of the most consistently grumbled about features of village economic life across the whole of medieval Europe, not necessarily because millers were especially dishonest, though popular imagination of the era certainly loved to accuse them of exactly that, thumb pressed just a little too heavily on the scale, but simply because it represents one more small, unavoidable subtraction from an already narrow margin of survival. Beyond the smith and the miller, a village of this size might support, part-time and often alongside their own farming strips, a carpenter or wheelwright skilled in the construction and repair of carts, plow frames, and the timber framing of houses themselves, a tanner or leatherworker, whose unglamorous but essential trade turns animal hides into the leather needed for harness, shoes, and simple bags, and, in the household work of Edith and the other village women, an entire informal economy of weaving, brewing, and small-scale trading in surplus eggs, cheese, or cloth, exchanged between households or occasionally carried to a nearby market town on the rare occasions a family has anything genuine to sell. None of these trades exist entirely separately from the farming life we explored in Part 1. The blacksmith farms his own strips when the forge allows. The carpenter's family keeps a garden and perhaps a few animals. Just like everyone else. Specialization, in this world, is always partial, always layered on top of the basic universal fact that nearly everyone, whatever their particular skill, ultimately depends on the land, the seasons, and their own two hands for survival. The church bell in the afternoon. Somewhere in the midst of all this scattered village activity, the ringing forge, the turning mill wheel, the children at play on the common, the women gathered at the well, the church bell sounds again, marking the office of none, the mid-afternoon hour of prayer, one more small, steady pulse in the deep rhythm of sacred time that shapes this entire community's sense of the day, quite apart from any sun or shadow. It is worth pausing on this a moment, because it is easy, from the distance of our own more secular century, to underestimate just how completely the church's rhythm structures the interior experience of a day like this. 1. The bell does not simply mark time the way a clock might, it invites, gently but insistently, a small act of attention and devotion from anyone within earshot, however briefly, a peasant in the field pausing to cross himself and murmur a fragment of prayer before returning to his sewing, a woman at the well falling quiet for a moment before resuming her conversation, a child on the common glancing instinctively toward the small stone tower at the heart of the village. The church itself, sitting at the physical center of this village just as it sits at the center of its sense of time, is very often the largest and most solidly built structure for miles in any direction, built of stone, where the cottages around it are built of timber and mud, a visible, permanent reminder, in a world where nearly everything else is impermanent, rebuilt and repaired generation after generation from perishable materials. That something here is meant to endure. Its walls, inside, are very often decorated with painted images. Scenes from scripture, saints, sometimes a vivid, deliberately frightening image of the Last Judgment above. The chancel arch, meant to be read, quite literally, by villagers who cannot read a single word of any book. Through image alone. For Watt and Edith and their children, the church is not one institution among several competing for their attention, it is, in a very real sense, the single most important source of meaning, explanation, and hope available to them in a world that otherwise offers very little certainty about anything beyond the next harvest. Small disputes and village custom. Not every moment of this long afternoon is without its friction, and it is worth resisting, gently, any temptation to imagine this village as some perfectly harmonious idyll, untouched by ordinary human disagreement. A village of 30 or 40 households, bound together as tightly as this one is by shared land, shared obligations, and constant daily proximity, inevitably produces its own steady, low hum of small disputes, a stray pig that has rooted up a neighbor's carefully tended garden plot, an argument over whose turn it truly is to use the shared plow team this week, a lingering resentment, muttered about at the well, over whether the miller's toll last month was really quite as fair as he claimed. These disputes, when they cannot be settled quietly between the households involved, find their way eventually to the manor court, not a court in the grand sense we might imagine, with robed judges and elaborate procedure, but a regular gathering, presided over by the Lord Steward or bailiff, where villagers themselves, drawn from among the more respected senior peasants, serve as jurors, weighing disputes. According to the accumulated custom of the manor itself, a body of unwritten but very real law built up over generations of precedent, every bit as binding, in its own local way, as any formal statute. A fine here, a public apology there, an agreed-upon arrangement for shared use of a resource. This is the quiet, largely self-governing machinery by which a village like this one manages its own internal frictions, appealing to the lords' authority only as a final backstop, while handling the great bulk of its own daily disagreements through the same web of custom, reputation, and mutual dependence that governs so much else of village life. The weaver's thread and the winter ahead. Before we leave the village's trades entirely and return to the fields, let us rest a little longer on the loom itself, because the slow, patient work of turning wool into cloth touches nearly every household in the village in one way or another, and stands, in its own quiet fashion, as one of the great unsung labors of the medieval world. The wool that will eventually clothe what's family begins, months before it ever reaches Edith's spindle, on the backs of the village's sheep, the same small flock that Robin watches this very afternoon out on the common pasture. Sheared once a year, usually in late spring or early summer, the raw fleece must first be washed to remove the natural grease and dirt it carries, then carded, combed out with a pair of flat wooden paddles set with short wire teeth, or in earlier generations with dried teasel heads, until the tangled fibers lie parallel and smooth, ready for spinning. Only then does it become thread, twisted out steadily, hour after patient hour, on the simple drop spindle that never seems to leave Edith's hands for long, or, for households fortunate enough to own one, a spinning wheel, which by this century has begun slowly spreading across the English countryside, though it remains, even so, a genuine luxury beyond many families' means. From thread to cloth is a longer journey still, one that occupies the quieter, darker months of the year far more than the busy growing season we are following now. Weaving itself, at the simple upright or horizontal looms found in peasant households, is slow, exacting work, and a single length of cloth sufficient to clothe one member of the family might represent many long winter evenings of labor by firelight, worked between other tasks, between children's needs, between the thousand other small demands on Edith's constantly occupied hands. Dyeing, where a family can afford or gather the materials for it, draws on whatever the surrounding countryside offers, wode for a rich blue, weld or onion skins for a warm yellow, madder root, where it can be had, for a deep, prized red. Though for most ordinary peasant clothing, the natural cream, brown, and gray of undyed wool remains the everyday reality, colorful dyed cloth being reserved, more often than not, for a family's very best garments, worn only on feast days and to church. It is worth pausing, too, on just how much labor a single garment represents in this world, compared to our own. A woolen tunic that a modern person might purchase in minutes, made in a factory in hours, represents, in what in Edith's world, months of accumulated labor stretched across an entire year, the sheep's own year of growing its fleece, the shearing, the washing, the carding, the spinning, the weaving, the cutting and sewing by hand with a simple bone or bronze needle and thread spun from the same wool. Clothing, in this light, is never a casual or disposable thing. It is patched, mended, handed down from an older child to a younger one, remade and repurposed again and again, until whatever scraps remain are finally too worn and thin for anything but rag, at which point even those find their final use as kindling or as material for a child's simple stuffed toy. Animals and the rhythm of care. The afternoon's work is not only a matter of soil and seed, scattered throughout Watts and every other household's day is the steady, unglamorous labor of tending the animals on which this entire village's survival so heavily depends, a labor that receives, in most tellings of medieval history, far less attention than the dramatic sweep of plowing and harvest, and yet occupies real hours of nearly every single day, all year round, without exception or rest. The ox or oxen that pulled what's plow in the days before this morning's harrowing must be fed, watered, and cared for, whether the weather is fair or foul, whether it is a working day or a feast day, whether what himself feels well or ill. The same is true of the family's cow, if they keep one, whose daily milking cannot simply be postponed to a more convenient hour, and of the pig, rooting contentedly in whatever scraps and forage the household can spare, slowly fattening toward its eventual autumn slaughter, and of the small flock of hens, whose eggs supplement the family's diet in ways too easily taken for granted. This constancy of animal care shapes the underlying structure of peasant life in ways that go well beyond the individual chores themselves. It means that a peasant family, however exhausted from a long day's fieldwork, however sick or grieving or simply tired, can never entirely set down the day's labor and rest, not completely. Not the way a modern worker might close a laptop and walk away from an office. The animals must still be seen to. The fire must still be tended. This is not experienced, by Wat or Edith or anyone else in this village, as a particular burden worth remarking upon. It is simply the shape of life itself, as constant and unremarkable as breathing, the quiet, ceaseless undercurrent of care and attention that keeps this entire fragile household afloat, day after day, season after season, for an entire lifetime. Watching the western sky. As the afternoon wears on, that same thin, high scatter of cloud we noticed drifting westward this morning has begun, subtly, to thicken and lower along the horizon, and Wat, straightening from his work every so often to press a hand into his lower back, finds his glance drawn there more and more often as the hours pass. It is impossible to say, with any real certainty, whether tonight will bring rain. The sky in this world offers hints and patterns, not guarantees, and Wat's accumulated weather knowledge, however deep and hard won, has been wrong before, as it will be wrong again, because the sky itself, in the end, answers to no one's careful reading of it. But the particular deepening gray building along the western horizon, and a certain new heaviness to the breeze, carrying now a cooler, damper edge than the light morning wind we felt at the start of Part 1, together suggest to Wat's practiced eye that rain may well arrive before tomorrow's dawn, not an unwelcome thing, necessarily, for oats freshly sown and eager for moisture to swell their first roots, but a consideration all the same, shaping, in small quiet ways, exactly how he chooses to spend these final hours of daylight. If rain is coming, better to finish what can be finished today, while the ground is still dry enough to work properly, rather than leave a task half done for a wet tomorrow when the heavy clay soil of the lower fields will cling to boot and plow blade alike and make anything beyond the most essential animal care nearly impossible. And so Wat quickens his pace, just slightly, angling his afternoon's remaining work toward whatever task seems most urgent to complete before the sky above the village finally makes good on its long, slow gathering threat. The reeve, the bailiff, and the lord's due. As the afternoon deepens, it is worth pausing, too, to speak honestly about a presence that hangs, quietly, but constantly, over every single day we have spent so far in this village, the presence of the manor, and the Lord to whom this entire community, in one form or another, ultimately answers. Wat and his family are not, in the strict legal sense of this world, free in the way we might imagine freedom today. Most peasants of this era exist within a system historians call manorialism, bound to the land and to the lord who holds it through a complex, deeply entrenched web of customary obligations passed down family by family, across generations. Some of these obligations take the form of rent, paid in produce, in coin. Where coin is available, or, most commonly of all, in labor itself, a fixed number of days each week. Particularly during the busiest seasons of plowing, sowing, and harvest, when a peasant like what is required to set aside his own strips entirely and instead work the Lord's own fields, known as the domain, alongside his neighbors. This system is overseen, at the local level, not by the Lord himself, who very often lives at some distance and visits his manor only occasionally, but by officials drawn in part from the village's own ranks, a reeve, typically a respected senior peasant elected or appointed from among the villagers themselves, responsible for organizing the practical daily business of labor obligations and field management, and a bailiff, usually a more direct agent of the Lord, responsible for overseeing rents, dues, and the manor's broader interests, and answerable directly to the Lord or his steward. This afternoon, as it happens, is not one of what's obligated labor days, those, as we will see in the parts of this history still ahead of us, cluster most heavily around the demanding weeks of plowing, haymaking, and harvest, when the Lord's own fields, no less than the peasant's own strips, must be worked in time with the turning season. For now, this particular afternoon belongs to Watt's own land, his own family survival, and it is with a certain quiet, unspoken relief. The relief of a man spending his labor on his own behalf rather than another's, that he and Osbert make their way back out toward the fields once the midday meal is finished. The sun now well past its highest point and beginning, almost imperceptibly, its long slow decline toward evening. The afternoon returns to the fields. The rhythm of the afternoon, once it begins, settles quickly back into something close to the rhythm of the morning we spent with what in part 1. The same steady, patient labor, the same wide sweep of open fields. Under a now slightly hazier spring sky, clouds beginning to gather, thin and high, along the western horizon in a way that what notices without quite thinking about it, filing the observation away in that same deep, wordless store of weather knowledge we spoke of earlier. There is more sowing yet to finish, on strips beyond the one we watched him complete this morning, and beyond that, 100 smaller tasks that fill the margins of a peasant farmer's day, mending a gap in the low hedge or fence that keeps stray animals from wandering into a neighbor's growing crop, clearing stones turned up by the plow from the surface of a strip, tossed onto the low earthen bulk at its edge, where generations of accumulated stones have slowly built into a long, low ridge that will still be visible, faintly, in the shape of the land itself, centuries after Watt and his entire world have been forgotten, checking on the small flock of sheep out on the common, where Robin, his sheep-watching duties for the day finally beginning in earnest, sits now on a low grassy hillock at the pasture's edge, a long wooden crook laid across his knees, watching the flock graze with the particular mixture of real attentiveness and drifting daydream that occupies most of any 8-year-old's long afternoon watch. Osbert, working his own strip a short distance from Watt's, calls out from time to time, a comment on the gathering clouds, a question about whether what means to try plowing the far strip before the rain comes, the easy, unhurried back and forth of two men who have worked these same fields alongside each other for their entire lives, whose fathers worked them alongside each other before that, and whose sons, in all likelihood, will work them alongside each other still, long after both Watt and Osbert have been laid to rest in the small churchyard at the heart of the village. This is, perhaps, one of the quietest and most easily overlooked truths of the entire medieval peasant world. How much of its labor was never solitary at all, however much our own imagination, shaped by very different ideas about individual privacy and independence, might picture a lone farmer bent alone over his own small plot. In truth, the open field system itself, with its long strips scattered and intermixed across shared Common land made genuine solitude in farming almost structurally impossible. What is never really alone out here? Osbert's voice carries easily across the low, unfenced boundary between their strips. Other villagers work their own scattered holdings within easy sight and sound in every direction, the whole wide expanse of the open fields functions, in effect, as one enormous shared workplace, where private land and public community exist not as opposites but as two sides of the very same daily reality. There is a deeper logic behind this scattering of strips, too, one worth resting on for a moment, because it is easy to look at the open field system from a distance and see only inefficiency. Why, after all, would any family willingly hold its land in a dozen or more separate narrow strips scattered across several different fields, rather than in one single, convenient block close to home? The answer lies in the same hard, practical wisdom that governs everything else in this village's approach to survival. Not every strip of land is equally good in every year, and by holding a scattered mix of strips across fields of different soil, different drainage, and different sun exposure, a family like what spreads its risk across the whole varied landscape rather than staking its entire harvest on a single patch of ground that might, in a particularly wet or dry year, fail badly, while other soils nearby thrive. A strip on the well-drained higher ground and a strip on the moisture-holding lower ground beside the stream are, in effect, a kind of ancient insurance policy, arrived at not through any formal calculation but through the same generations of hard-earned trial and observation that shape every other piece of this village's accumulated agricultural wisdom. This scattering also binds the village together in another way, quite apart from its practical benefits for any single family, because everyone's strips lie interspersed with everyone else's decisions about when to plow, when to sow, and, crucially, months from now, when to harvest cannot really be made by any single household in isolation. The whole open field, or at least a very large section of it, tends to move through the agricultural calendar together, by a kind of loose, informal common agreement worked out season after season, because a single family harvesting early while its neighbor's unharvested strips still stand close beside its own newly cleared ground creates exactly the kind of boundary confusion and stray animal trouble that village custom, and the manor court behind it, exists to prevent. The manor house, glimpsed from afar, somewhere beyond the fields Watt and Osbert have worked all day, rising a little above the surrounding land, sits the manor house itself, not a castle, not for a village of this modest size, but a solid, comfortable hall of timber or stone, larger by far than any peasant cottage, with its own separate kitchen, its own barns and stables, its own small orchard and garden tended by servants rather than by the Lord's own hands. The Lord who holds this manor may be a knight of relatively modest means, or he may hold his lands from a greater baron above him in turn, who holds them from the king himself, in the long, layered chain of obligation that structures the whole of medieval landholding, each level owing military service, loyalty, or simple deference to the level above it, all the way to the crown. He may, in truth, be an absent figure for much of the year, more concerned with matters of war or court far beyond this village's quiet horizon, leaving the daily management of his estate to the steward and bailiff we spoke of earlier, or he may be a closer, more present figure, known personally to Watt and every other villager, his moods and preferences a matter of real daily consequence to the whole community. Either way, his presence shapes the very shape of this day, even in his physical absence. The strips of domain land scattered among the village's own open fields, worked, as we noted, by peasant labor owed as rent rather than paid in coin, exist because of him. The mill's toll, the church's own complicated relationship with the manor court that settles the village's disputes, even the very legal status of families like Watt's, bound to this land by custom and obligation rather than free to simply leave and seek a different life elsewhere. All of it traces back, in the end, to this same distant hall, glimpsed now only as a low roofline against the thickening western sky, a constant, largely unspoken presence at the edge of every calculation this village makes about its own labor and its own time. And yet it would be a mistake, too, to imagine Watt's relationship to this arrangement as one of simple, constant resentment, however real the burden of labor dues and rents genuinely is. This is, quite simply, the world as it has always been, within any memory Watt or his father's father before him could summon, not a system chosen or debated, but a structure as fundamental and unquestioned as the turning of the seasons themselves, and Watt's own energies, on an ordinary afternoon like this one, are directed not toward questioning that structure but toward the immediate, absorbing, practical business of getting his own strip properly sown before the gathering rain arrives. Toward evening. Slowly, so slowly it is difficult to mark any single moment of change, the light begins to shift. The sun, which stood high and strong at midday, now hangs lower in the western sky, its light turning from the sharp, clear gold of early afternoon into something softer, warmer, more slanted, throwing long shadows out across the fields from every standing figure, every hedgerow, every scattered tree at the field's edge. The rhythms of the village begin, in response, their own slow evening shift. Out on the common, Robin gathers the family's sheep together with the low, practiced calls and gentle motions of his crook that he has watched grown men use his entire short life, beginning the unhurried walk back toward the village and the small fold, or enclosed pen, where the flock will spend the night safe from wolves and thieves alike. The blacksmith's hammer, which has rung out steadily across the village for most of the afternoon, falls gradually, silent as the day's forge work winds down. Somewhere, a woman's voice calls a child's name, the universal sound of an evening meal beginning to take shape and a family beginning to gather itself back together after a long day scattered across fields and pastures and workshops. Watt and Osbert, working the last stretch of light available to them, exchange a final few words about tomorrow's tasks and part ways at the edge of the fields, each turning toward his own low, smoke-threaded roof, each walking the same tired, satisfied walk of a man who has given a full day's honest labor to land that will, in turn, if the season is kind, give his family what they need to survive the year ahead. Back in the village, the day's slow gathering in continues in 100 small, overlapping ways. Edith has already begun drawing the household back toward its center, calling Mary in from wherever she has been playing near the cottage door, checking the cradle where the infant has woken, fretful, from an afternoon's sleep, setting a little more water to warm over a fire built up again after its own quiet midday rest. The hens, needing no real herding at all, make their own unhurried way back toward their coop as the light softens, an old, reliable habit built into their very nature. Down by the stream, a few of the village's geese honk their way homeward too, driven along by whichever child has been given charge of them today, in a scene that repeats itself, with only the smallest variations, in village after village across the whole width of the English countryside on this and every ordinary spring evening. Robin, meanwhile, has nearly finished his walk back from the common with the family's small flock of sheep. The animals moving with the calm, practiced ease of creatures who have made this same short journey home 1,000 times before, needing from him now only the occasional soft word or light tap of his crook to keep them moving steadily in the right direction, past the low garden tofts and along the muddy lane, toward the small wattle-fenced fold near the cottage where they will spend the night, safe, or as safe as this world allows, from the wolves and foxes that still range the wooded edges beyond the village's cleared fields. The light, by now, has taken on that particular deep amber quality of a spring evening, low sun striking the underside of the gathering clouds and turning them, briefly, the soft color of a banked fire, before the gray of coming rain reasserts itself along the horizon. Smoke from a dozen cottage fires rises straighter now, in the stiller air of early evening, than it did in the busier, wind-stirred hours of midday, each thin column marking a household drawing itself back together after a long day scattered across field and pasture and workshop. Each one carrying, faintly, the promise of a warm meal and a night's rest still to come. It is here, as the light softens toward evening and the whole village begins its slow gathering in, animals to their folds and byres, children to their mothers, tools to their proper places by the cottage wall, that we will let this second part of our long, slow history come gently to rest. Let your own mind rest here too, in this warm, unhurried hour between the work of the day and the quiet of the coming evening, in the long shadows stretching soft and gold across an old, forgotten field, in the simple, ancient comfort of a family drawing back together after a day spent, each in their own way, in service of the same shared survival, and let all of it gently, gently, carry you now down into sleep. End of Part 2. Part 3 continues with the evening meal, the fire rebuilt for the night, the fold and the byre, and the slow settling of the whole village into darkness and rest.
Returning, once more, to the village. Let your body settle again, heavy and warm, into the place we have been visiting together across these last 2 parts. A small English village, 700 or 800 years gone, where the light has just begun to soften into evening, where smoke rises straight and slow from a dozen low roofs, and where a man named Watt and his neighbor Osbert have just parted ways at the edge of a field, each turning homeward after a long day's honest labor. If this is your first time joining us, none of that matters at all. You need only let your mind grow quiet, let your breathing slow, and let yourself drift into this same soft evening hour, where a whole small world is drawing itself gently inward, animals to their folds, children to their mothers, the whole scattered business of a working day folding itself, piece by piece, back into the close, warm dark of home. There is nothing left to do now but listen, and drift, and follow this old, forgotten day all the way to its end, through the evening meal, through the last small chores of dusk, through the fire built up one final time and then banked low for the night, and onward, at last, into the deep, wide, patient quiet that settles over a village like this one once every lamp is out and every voice has fallen still. Let go of anything you are still holding. There is only this evening now, and the slow, certain pull of sleep waiting at the end of it. The fold and the byre. Before any family in this village can properly turn its attention to its own evening meal, there is the steady, unhurried work of bringing the animals safely in for the night, a task so constant, so woven into the very shape of a peasant's day, that it barely registers as a distinct chore at all, any more than closing a door behind oneself registers as a separate decision. We watched Robin, a little earlier, walking the family's small flock of sheep back from the common pasture, his long wooden crook resting easy across his shoulder, the animals moving with the calm, practiced obedience of creatures who know this short journey by heart. Now, as he reaches the edge of the village, he turns them in through a low gate of woven wattle hurdles into the fold. A simple enclosed pen, sometimes standing permanently beside the house, sometimes built fresh each evening from portable hurdle panels that can be moved, section by section, to a different patch of ground the following night, so that the sheep's own manure, dropped through the night hours, spreads itself gradually and usefully across the family's land rather than accumulating uselessly in one single spot. This detail, small as it seems, points towards something genuinely important about how deeply interconnected every part of this world truly is. The sheep are not simply livestock kept for wool and the occasional meal of meat. They are, in a very real sense, a slow, living fertilizer machine, and a peasant family's decision about exactly where to fold its sheep on any given night is a decision about which strip of land will receive a little more of the enrichment it needs to yield a better harvest next season. Nothing here is wasted, because nothing here can afford to be wasted. The ox, meanwhile, or the family's cow, if oxen are beyond their means, is led into the byre, a section of the cottage itself in many humbler households, as we saw back in Part 1, or a small separate timber structure standing close beside the house in slightly more prosperous ones. Here it will spend the night on a bed of straw, chewing whatever forage has been saved for it, its warm breath and warmer bulk adding real, welcome heat to the household through the cold hours of darkness still to come, even now, in a mild spring, when the worst of winter's chill has already passed. The pig, rooting contentedly through the day in whatever scraps and forage the household could spare, is driven, with rather more noisy protest than the sheep or the cow ever offer, into its own small enclosure, and the hens, needing almost no herding at all, have already tucked themselves up on their own into the low wattle coop where they roost each night, safe from the fox that everyone in this village knows, from long experience, prowls the hedgerows once true dark falls, closing the day's gaps. There is, alongside the animals themselves, a whole quiet ritual of closing up that belongs to this hour of the evening. Gates checked and fastened, gaps in fencing noted for tomorrow's mending, the wooden clapper Robin carried all day now hung on its peg by the door, tools brought in from the field's edge and set carefully in their accustomed places along the cottage wall, because a scythe or a rake left carelessly out overnight in the damp spring air will rust or warp, and a family that cannot easily replace a broken tool has no room for such small, avoidable losses. What, arriving home now himself, walks a final slow circuit around the cottage and its immediate surroundings before stepping inside, an old habit, unspoken and barely conscious, that checks the fold is properly latched, that the woodpile stacked against the house wall is adequately covered against the rain that still threatens along the western sky, that nothing obvious has gone wrong in the short interval since he last passed this way. This is not anxiety, exactly, though there is a thread of real caution woven through it. It is simply the settled, practiced vigilance of a man whose entire family's well-being rests on 100 small, unglamorous details being attended to correctly, day after day, without fail. The evening meal. Inside, Edith has been building the fire back up for the last hour or more, feeding it patiently from the small store of dry kindling and splitwood kept close at hand for exactly this purpose, coaxing the low midday embers back into a proper cooking flame strong enough to finish the evening's meal. The smell that fills the cottage now is thicker and warmer than the midday pottages had been. Not because the ingredients are especially different, but because the evening meal, in most peasant households, tends to be the more substantial of the day's two main meals, the one that must carry the family through a long night and into the following morning's lighter breaking of the fast. Tonight's pot holds much the same base as midday's did. Grain, peas or beans, whatever the garden offers this early in spring, perhaps a little more generously seasoned, perhaps, on a fortunate evening, with a small addition of the salted bacon kept carefully stored for exactly such occasions. Bread again, the same dark, dense loaf from the communal oven, torn and dipped. And ale. Weak, low-alcohol ale, brewed by Edith herself or by one of the village's part-time aloes from barley malt, an everyday drink for every member of the family, children included, not out of any particular fondness for its mild intoxicating effect but simply because the water available in this world, drawn from wells and streams of uncertain purity, carries real risk of illness, while ale, boiled in its brewing, offers a genuinely safer alternative, quite apart from any question of taste or tradition. The family gathers again, as they did at midday, around the low table and its rough benches, though the mood of this meal carries a different weight than the midday one did, less the brief, practical pause of a working day's middle, and more the settled, unhurried close of the whole day's labor. What eats with the particular deep satisfaction of a man whose body has spent itself fully and honestly since before dawn. Edith, no less tired from her own long day of milking and spinning and mending and mothering, finds in this meal one of her own few moments of genuine rest, seated rather than standing, eating rather than serving, at least for these few unhurried minutes before the evening's remaining small tasks resume. Robin, worn out from his afternoon on the common, eats with less of his midday energy, and more of a growing evening drowsiness. Mary, close beside her mother, has begun the particular fretful, overtired restlessness common to small children as a long day nears its end, and the infant, fed and changed and momentarily content, watches the fire's low orange light with the wide, unfocused fascination of the very young. What the season allows. It is worth pausing here to say something honest about just how much this evening meal, indeed, every meal across this entire long day, depends on where, exactly, this particular week falls within the great turning wheel of the agricultural year, because a peasant family's table in medieval England was never a fixed, unchanging thing, but something that shifted constantly with the seasons in ways that shaped daily life far more completely than most of us, accustomed to grocery stores stocked identically in January and July alike, can easily imagine. This evening, in the early growing weeks of spring, the table is at its leanest point of the entire year. Last autumn's harvest, however successful it may have been, has now been drawn upon steadily for the better part of 6 or 7 months, and the store of grain in its wooden bin has grown noticeably lower than it was at Christmas, while the new season's crops, the very oats what sowed this morning among them, remain many long weeks from providing anything at all. This stretch of the calendar, running roughly from late winter through late spring, is sometimes called, by later historians looking back on this world, the hungry gap. And though Watt and Edith would never use so tidy a phrase for it themselves, they know its reality intimately. A season of careful rationing, of stretching what remains as far as it will go, of watching the garden's first tender spring greens with real relief because they offer fresh food at precisely the moment the winter's stores are thinnest. By contrast, come high summer, with the garden fully productive and the first of the early grain perhaps ready for harvest, and again in the rich weeks following a good autumn harvest, this same family's table will look and feel entirely different. More varied, more abundant meat and fresh produce appearing with a regularity that this lean spring evening cannot match. The whole rhythm of a peasant's eating, in other words, tracks the turning of the agricultural year with an intimacy almost impossible for us, in our own season-blind century, to fully recover in imagination. And it is this same rhythm, this same deep, patient waiting on the land's own timing, that shapes not only what fills the pot each evening but the entire emotional texture of the year itself, its anxious spring hunger giving way, in time, to summer's cautious hope and autumn's real relief. What the season allows. It is worth pausing here to say something honest about just how much this evening meal, indeed, every meal across this entire long day, depends on where, exactly, this particular week falls within the great turning wheel of the agricultural year, because a peasant family's table in medieval England was never a fixed, unchanging thing, but something that shifted constantly with the seasons in ways that shaped daily life far more completely than most of us, accustomed to grocery stores stocked identically in January and July alike, can easily imagine. This evening, in the early growing weeks of spring, the table is at its leanest point of the entire year. Last autumn's harvest, however successful it may have been, has now been drawn upon steadily for the better part of 6 or 7 months, and the store of grain in its wooden bin has grown noticeably lower than it was at Christmas, while the new season's crops, the very oats what sowed this morning among them, remain many long weeks from providing anything at all. This stretch of the calendar, running roughly from late winter through late spring, is sometimes called, by later historians looking back on this world, the hungry gap. And though Watt and Edith would never use so tidy a phrase for it themselves, they know its reality intimately. A season of careful rationing, of stretching what remains as far as it will go, of watching the garden's first tender spring greens with real relief because they offer fresh food at precisely the moment the winter's stores are thinnest. By contrast, come high summer, with the garden fully productive and the first of the early grain perhaps ready for harvest, and again in the rich weeks following a good autumn harvest, this same family's table will look and feel entirely different. More varied, more abundant meat and fresh produce appearing with a regularity that this lean spring evening cannot match. The whole rhythm of a peasant's eating, in other words, tracks the turning of the agricultural year with an intimacy almost impossible for us, in our own season-blind century, to fully recover in imagination. And it is this same rhythm, this same deep, patient waiting on the land's own timing, that shapes not only what fills the pot each evening but the entire emotional texture of the year itself, its anxious spring hunger giving way, in time, to summer's cautious hope and autumn's real relief. The question of enough. There is a quieter, more private calculation running beneath this whole meal too, one that neither Wat nor Edith would ever speak aloud at the table in front of the children, though both of them carry it, in some wordless way, through nearly every meal of this lean season, the constant, careful weighing of what remains in store against how many weeks still stretch between now and the first real relief of summer. A family in Wat's position holds, at any given moment, a rough working sense of its own stores. How much grain remains in the bin, how many strips of bacon still hang in the smoke of the chimney, how far the garden's first thin offerings might stretch a pot of pottage before real hunger sets in. This is not arithmetic performed with any formal precision. There are no written ledgers in this household, no numbers set down on parchment the way a monastery's careful cellarer might record his own stores. It is, instead, a kind of embodied, intuitive accounting, built from long practice and painful memory, the same instinct that tells Edith, without her ever quite deciding to think it through, exactly how generous a portion of tonight's bread she can allow each member of the family without risking real want 3 or 4 weeks from now. Most years, in most seasons, this careful management is simply the unremarkable background hum of household life, no more anxious in its texture than a modern family's own quiet awareness of what remains in the pantry before the next trip to the shop. But it is worth remembering, gently, that this same calculation, in a genuinely bad year, a failed harvest, a hard winter, a sickness that keeps Wat from the fields at a crucial planting week, could tip from unremarkable background hum into something considerably more frightening, and that the whole steady, patient rhythm of care we have followed across these 3 parts exists, in the end, precisely because a family in this world has so very little margin between an ordinary hungry spring and a genuinely desperate one. The fire rebuilt for the night. As the meal finishes and the last of the daylight fades from the small, high, unglazed window openings, mere gaps in the wattle and daub wall, covered at night, in colder months, with a shutter of wood or a stretched, oiled cloth to keep out the worst of the chill, attention in the household turns, as it does every single evening without exception, to the fire itself, and to the delicate, essential work of preparing it to survive the long hours of darkness ahead. We spoke, back in part 1, of the banked embers that greeted us at the very start of this whole long day, and now, as that day comes full circle, we arrive at the moment those embers are made. Edith, or sometimes Wat himself, rakes the fire's remaining coals together into a single dense, glowing mound near the center of the hearth, then covers them carefully with a fine layer of ash. Not so much as to smother them entirely, but enough to slow their burning to the barest possible trickle, a single patient ember or small cluster of embers that will glow on, quietly, invisibly, through the whole of the night, needing no attention at all until morning, when a few careful breaths and a little fresh kindling will coax it back to full flame. This nightly banking of the fire is, in its own understated way, one of the great small technologies of the entire medieval world, and one easy to overlook precisely because it requires no special tool at all beyond a practiced hand and an inherited, hard-won knowledge of exactly how much ash, packed exactly how densely, will slow a fire's burning without extinguishing it altogether. Fire, as we noted at the very start of this history, is not a thing simply switched on in this world. A lost ember, on a bitterly cold night with no dry tinder at hand and no flint readily available, could mean real hardship, and so this quiet nightly ritual, one of the very last acts of the whole long day, carries within it a weight of responsibility that goes well beyond its simple, unremarkable appearance. The Compline Bell. Somewhere across the darkening village, as this same fire-banking ritual repeats itself in cottage after cottage, the church bell sounds one final time for the day, marking Compline, the last of the canonical hours, sung or said quietly in the small stone church by whichever villagers, often fewer at this hour than at any other, given how tired a full day's labor leaves most of the parish, have the energy and inclination to attend. Compline, in the wider monastic tradition from which this entire structure of daily prayer descends, is understood as a prayer specifically for protection through the vulnerable hours of night, a fitting close to a day that has, in its own quiet way, been shaped from its first waking moment to its last by exactly this same underlying awareness of how much of ordinary survival depends on forces beyond any single person's control. For a village like this one, without any of what we might now think of as basic safety and security, the coming of full darkness genuinely does represent a period of heightened vulnerability to fire, unwatched, to wolves and other predators drawn nearer to human settlements by hunger, particularly in the leaner months. To the more human dangers of theft, though a village this small and this tightly bound by mutual knowledge and dependence offers a thief relatively few easy, anonymous opportunities. The bell's final ringing of the day, then, is not merely a marker of time but something closer to a shared communal exhale. An acknowledgement, repeated every single evening, that the day's labor and the day's risks are now, largely, complete, and that what remains is simply to entrust the coming dark hours to whatever combination of careful preparation and quiet faith this world's people have always relied upon. Evening by the fire. For a little while yet before the household finally settles fully into sleep, there remains a small, precious window of true evening leisure. Brief, and never entirely free of ongoing small tasks, but real nonetheless, and treasured, in its modest way, as one of the very few stretches of the day given over to something closer to rest than to labor. Edith's hands, even now, are rarely entirely still. The spindle that occupied so many scattered minutes of her working day finds its way back into her fingers by firelight, the twisting of wool into thread continuing by the fire's low, flickering glow even as the rest of the household's attention turns towards something closer to relaxation. What, seated on the bench nearest the fire, might occupy these last waking minutes mending a piece of harness leather, or simply sitting, hands finally still, watching the fire's low light and feeling, in the particular loosening of long tense muscles, the accumulated weight of a full day's labor beginning, at last, to ease. It is in this quiet hour, too, more than at almost any other point in the day, that this family's oral culture comes most fully alive. Because in a world without books that anyone in this household could read, without any writing at all beyond the priest's own Latin scripture and the manor's careful legal records, the entire vast store of this community's knowledge, memory, belief, and entertainment lives nowhere else but in spoken words, passed voice to voice, evening to evening, generation to generation. What might tell Robin, half in earnest and half simply for the pleasure of the telling, some old story of his own grandfather's time, a hard winter survived, a wolf driven off, a boundary dispute settled by some clever village elders ruling, remembered now less as strict fact than as a kind of family and village mythology, reshaped a little with each retelling, as such stories always are. Edith might sing, softly, some old lullaby to the fussing infant, a melody and a set of words she herself learned from her own mother in exactly this same firelit hour, years and years before, in a chain of transmission stretching back further than anyone in this room could name. Mary, drowsy now, leans against her mother's side, half listening, half already drifting toward sleep. Robin, despite his own tiredness, fights it a little longer, the particular stubborn wakefulness of a child not yet ready to concede the day is over, even as his eyelids grow steadily heavier in the fire's warm, hypnotic light. Beliefs beneath the ordinary. It's worth resting a little longer in this firelit hour, because it offers us a genuine window into something easy to overlook in a history built mostly around plowing and pottage. The rich, largely unrecorded inner and imaginative life of people like What and Edith, whose beliefs about the world extended well beyond the Church's own official teaching into a dense, half-Christian, half-older layer of folk belief woven through the fabric of everyday life. The natural world around this village is not, to What's or Edith's understanding, simply inert matter obeying impersonal physical law, the way our own more scientifically minded century tends to picture it. It is populated, at its edges, with a whole quiet population of half-believed presences, a sense that certain old trees or springs carry a particular, half-sacred significance, older than the church itself and never quite fully displaced by it. A wariness about certain actions best avoided after dark, not from any formal doctrine but from long accumulated caution passed down exactly the way the fireside stories themselves are passed down. Small protective customs woven into the ordinary business of daily life, a particular way of banking the fire that carries, alongside its practical function, a whispered half-prayer for the household's safety through the night. A coin or a small offering left, on certain days of the year, at a boundary stone or a spring, blending old, pre-Christian custom with newer Christian meaning so thoroughly that neither what nor the priest himself could likely say, with real precision, where one ends and the other begins. None of this sits in any real tension, in what in Edith's own minds, with their sincere Christian faith, attended each week at the small stone church we have visited several times already across this history. The two systems of belief, official and folk, formal and inherited, exist here not as rivals but as two intertwined threads of the very same fabric, each offering its own kind of comfort and explanation for a world that remains, in the end, deeply uncertain, and against whose uncertainties this small firelit household reaches, every single evening, for whatever combination of practical preparation, inherited wisdom, and quiet faith it has at hand. Dreams themselves, too, are read differently in this world than in our own. A vivid dream is not, to what's understanding, simply the idle firing of a resting brain, a matter for psychology rather than meaning. It might carry a genuine message, a warning, a visitation from someone dead and remembered, or simply an omen worth turning over quietly the next morning, discussed perhaps with Edith, or, if it seems weighty enough, mentioned to the priest himself for his own reading of its significance. This is not superstition set apart from the rest of this family's thinking. It is simply one more thread in the same broad fabric of meaning that makes sense of harvests and illness and the turning of the seasons alike. A world in which very little is understood as pure chance, and almost everything, in one way or another, is understood as carrying some thread of significance beyond its own bare physical fact. First sleep and second sleep. There is one more thing worth knowing, in this final stretch of our long day together, about the particular shape that sleep itself is likely to take tonight in this household, because the sleep of a medieval peasant family did not always run in one single, unbroken stretch from dusk to dawn, the way most of our own modern nights are meant to. Historians who have studied the written records of this era closely, court documents, medical texts, diaries from the centuries just after this one, when literacy had spread widely enough to leave us a clearer record, have found scattered consistent references to something we might call segmented sleep, a first sleep, beginning not long after full dark, lasting perhaps 3 or 4 hours, followed by a period of quiet wakefulness in the deep, dark middle of the night, and then a second sleep, carrying the sleeper on through to the natural light of dawn. This waking interval, sometimes called simply the watch, in old records, was not experienced as insomnia or disturbance in the way a modern person, waking unexpectedly at 3 in the morning, might experience it with real frustration. It was, instead, an ordinary, expected part of the night's structure, a quiet hour used, by different people on different nights, for very different small purposes. A whispered prayer, a quiet conversation between husband and wife while children slept undisturbed around them, a period of calm, unhurried reflection, or simply a peaceful, undemanding wakefulness before drifting, without any particular effort, back down into sleep's second half. We cannot say with certainty that what in Edith's own night tonight will follow this exact pattern. Sleep, in this world as in ours, surely varied a great deal from person to person and night to night, shaped by tiredness, by the season, by whatever small worries or contentments a particular day has left behind. But it is a gentle, useful thing to hold in mind as we let our own sleep, tonight, follow wherever it wishes to go. That the tidy, unbroken 8 hours our own century tends to expect of a proper night's rest was never, in fact, the universal or inevitable shape of human sleep, and that a natural waking in the deep quiet of the night, far from being any kind of failure, may be one of the oldest, most ordinary rhythms the human body knows. One shared, quite possibly, with this very household, resting now in the dark just as you yourself are resting, drifting down through your own first sleep, whenever and however it chooses to arrive. The vulnerability of thatch and flame. One quiet undercurrent of anxiety runs beneath even the most peaceful of these medieval nights, worth acknowledging honestly before we let the whole village, and you along with it, sink fully into rest: the real, ever-present danger of fire. Nearly every roof in this village, what and Edith's own included, is thatched, a thick, tightly bundled layer of straw or reed, laid and maintained by a specialist thatcher's careful skill, offering excellent insulation against both summer heat and winter cold, and requiring, in exchange, a genuinely disciplined respect for the danger it represents. A single stray spark, escaping a fire insufficiently banked, or a lamp knocked carelessly against the wall, could in principle turn a whole roof, and with it an entire year's shelter and stored grain alike, into disaster within minutes, and worse, given how closely these thatched cottages stand clustered together along the village lane. A fire in one household carries real danger of spreading, roof to roof, before it can be contained. This is, in truth, part of why the nightly banking of the fire that we described earlier carries such real, careful attention in every single household of this village, night after night, without exception, not mere habit for its own sake, but a genuinely serious act of care, performed with the same unspoken gravity that a modern parent might bring to checking a smoke detector's battery. Village custom, too, reinforces this same caution in other quiet ways. An unspoken expectation that a household keeps some rough distance between its own thatch and any neighbor's, that straw and other especially flammable stores be kept a careful distance from the hearth, that any household whose fire does, on some rare and terrible occasion, get away from its careful banking can call, immediately, and without hesitation, on every neighboring household's help. Because a fire left to spread threatens not one family's home but the whole village's shared survival at once. Undressing for the night. As the fire settles lower and the last of the evening's small tasks wind down, the household begins, without any particular ceremony, its final preparations for sleep. Preparations considerably simpler, in this world, than in our own, but no less a real and settled part of the day's closing rhythm. There is little in the way of a separate nightgown or specialized sleepwear for most peasant families of this era. Clothing itself is too valuable, too labor-intensive to produce, as we explored at length in Part 2, to justify an entirely separate set of garments worn only for sleeping. Most often, the outer layers of the day's clothing, the heavier tunic, perhaps the leather shoes, whatever outer wrap has been worn against the day's weather, are removed and set carefully aside, while the simpler linen undergarment worn against the skin all day remains on through the night as well, providing a thin additional layer of warmth beneath the heavy wool blankets waiting on the bed. Robin and Mary, both now genuinely drowsy despite Robin's earlier resistance, are settled by Edith into their accustomed place in the shared bed, the particular warm, tangled arrangement of small bodies we pictured together back in Part 1, each child finding, by long habit, their own familiar spot within the family's collective warmth. The infant, fed one final time, is tucked into the woven cradle close beside the bed, within easy reach should the night bring the fretful waking that infants in every century, medieval or modern, reliably bring to their exhausted parents. The sound of a village falling quiet. There is a particular, easily missed pleasure in simply listening, for a few minutes, to the precise way a village like this one falls quiet each evening. Not all at once, the way a switched-off machine might fall silent, but gradually, unevenly, one small sound dropping away after another until almost nothing remains. First to go, usually, is the ring of the smith's hammer, silent now for hours already since the afternoon we spent among the village's trades in Part 2. Then the calling voices of children at play on the green, drawn in one by one to their own household's evening meals, until the last stray shout of some particularly reluctant child fades and is not repeated. The creak and clatter of carts and tools being put away for the night follows, then the soft, shuffling movement of animals being settled into fold and byre, each family's own small evening ritual playing out in its own good time, a little offset from its neighbors, so that across the whole village this settling down happens not as a single event but as a long, loose, overlapping wave, spreading gradually from household to household as the light itself fades. By the time full dark has properly arrived, what remains is only the barest handful of sounds: an owl somewhere in the wood beyond the fields, the stream's own endless quiet murmur, perhaps a dog's low answering bark somewhere across the green in response to some small disturbance too minor for any human in the village to trouble themselves over. It is a very particular kind of quiet, this. Not the sterile, engineered silence of a modern sealed room, but a living, breathing hush, full of small natural sound just beneath the threshold of real attention, the sound of an entire small world exhaling together after a long day's shared labor. The comfort of a shared bed. We have already, in Part 1, glimpsed the simple, practical arrangement of what and Edith's shared bed and the children's own place within or beside it, but it is worth returning to this detail once more now, in this final quiet hour before sleep, because it holds within it a genuine emotional truth about this family's life easy to overlook amid all our talk of ploughing and pottage and manor dues. There is very little in the way of private space in a household like this one: no separate bedroom for parents apart from children, no individual beds for each family member, none of the physical separation that our own century has come to associate, almost without questioning it, with basic comfort and dignity. And yet this close, shared physical arrangement carries its own real warmth, quite apart from the simple practical necessity of cooling body heat through a cold night. Mary, drifting towards sleep against her mother's side, and Robin, settling finally into his own accustomed place after his brief evening resistance, are held, every single night of their childhood, within an immediate, constant, wordless physical closeness to the two people responsible for their survival. A closeness that shapes, in ways no medieval person would have thought to articulate, but that we might recognize easily enough from our own understanding of early childhood, a deep, early sense of safety and belonging that asks for no private room, no separate space, only this: the steady presence of family, close enough to touch, through every single night of a childhood spent in a world that offers, in so many other ways, so very little certainty at all. The night watch. Before the household finally lies down together, there remains, in many villages of this kind, one final layer of communal preparation for the night that extends beyond any single family's own small rituals, a shared, rotating responsibility for watching over the village as a whole through the darkest hours, a duty that falls, on different nights, to different households in turn, according to long-established local custom. Tonight, it happens, is not what's turned for this particular obligation, and so he and his family can settle fully into their own rest without the interruption of a watch to keep. But somewhere else in the village, another man, perhaps a neighbor 2 or 3 cottages down, whose own family is even now settling into sleep without him for these first watching hours, will walk a slow, periodic circuit through the darkened lanes tonight, alert for any sign of fire escaping its careful banking, any stray animal loose and causing damage, any stranger's presence that custom and simple caution both suggest deserves a closer look. This is not a formal, uniformed policing in any sense we would recognize, but rather one more small expression of the same deep communal interdependence we explored at length in Part 1's discussion of the common land. A recognition, built into the very structure of village life, that the safety of any single household through the night depends, in the end, on the whole community's shared, rotating vigilance. Full dark over the village. By now, true darkness has settled fully over the whole scattered cluster of thatched roofs, broken only by the faintest orange glimmer here and there where a banked fire's low glow escapes through some small gap in a wall or a shutter, and by whatever thin, cold light the moon and stars offer on this particular night, unobscured, for now, by the clouds still gathering slowly along the western sky. The sounds of the village, so full and varied across the busy hours of daylight we spent with Wat and Osbert in the fields, have thinned now to almost nothing, the occasional soft stamp and shift of an ox or cow settling in its byre, the low, contented murmur of sheep bedded down together in their fold. Somewhere, faint and far off, the call of an owl beginning its own night's hunting in the dark would be on the fields, the same wood, perhaps, whose owl we heard finishing its final call at the very start of this whole long history, back at the beginning of Part 1, in that hushed hour just before what first stirred at the sound of the rooster's crow. The stream that runs past the edge of the village continues its own quiet, unbroken murmur over the same stones it has known for centuries, entirely indifferent to the sleeping village beside it, exactly as it was in the deep dark hour before dawn when we first slipped into this world together. There is no artificial light here worth the name, nothing like the electric glow that softens even our own darkest modern nights. What little light exists comes only from the sky itself and from the faint, jealously guarded embers behind each shuttered window, and this, too, shapes the texture of medieval night in ways easy to forget from within our own endlessly illuminated century. The dark here is real, total, encompassing, broken only by whatever the moon in its own slow monthly cycle chooses to offer, and on a night like tonight, with the moon still young and thin and the clouds beginning to thicken along the horizon, the village lies wrapped in a darkness deep enough that a traveler unfamiliar with its lanes might easily lose his way entirely between one cottage and the next, guided only by memory and touch and the faint, remembered shape of a path walked 10,000 times before. Inside the cottage, the fire has been fully banked now, its glow reduced to the barest whisper of orange beneath its careful blanket of ash, casting no real light at all into the room's deep shadow. What lies once more in his accustomed place nearest the door, that same old, unconscious habit of protection settling his body into position even before his mind has fully surrendered to sleep. Edith lies beside him, her own day's long labor, so different in its texture from his own and yet no less complete, finally allowed to rest. Between and around them, Robin and Mary sleep already, the particular deep, boneless sleep of children who have spent a whole day thoroughly, honestly tired, and beside the bed, the infant sleeps too, at least for this one uninterrupted stretch of the night, in the small woven cradle that has rocked, gently, so many children of this household to sleep before. The whole day, complete. We have now walked with this family through an entire ordinary day of their extraordinary, unrecorded lives. From the first gray hint of light before dawn, through the long morning's plowing and sowing, through the midday meal and the scattered, essential labor of the afternoon, through the trades and customs and quiet frictions of an entire small community, and now, at last, to this deep, settled hush of full night, every fire banked, every animal folded, every voice fallen finally silent. It is worth pausing, in this last quiet moment before we let sleep take you fully, to notice something about the shape of the day we have just spent together. How completely it is organized not around the clock we know so well in our own century, but around light and dark, labor and rest, the turning of a single sun across a single sky, repeated with only the smallest variations across every single day of what in Edith's entire lives, and their parents' lives before them, and though none of them could ever know it, countless generations of lives still to come after them. Each one walking this same ancient, patient rhythm of waking and working and resting and sleeping, bound not to any invention of gears or springs but to the oldest clock there has ever been. It is here, in this deep, complete, well-earned darkness, with the whole village finally still and every fire bank low, that we will let this third part of our long, slow history come, at last, fully to rest. Let yourself rest here too. In the warm, close dark of an old and simple room, in the quiet company of a family whose names have long since been forgotten by history but whose ordinary day, hour by patient hour, we have now walked all the way to its gentle end. There is nothing left to hold on to now. There is only this deep, wide, waiting dark, and the slow, certain, welcome pull of sleep, carrying you down, and down, and down, exactly as it has carried this whole small village, every single night, for centuries beyond counting. End of Part 3. Part 4 turns to a new season, the long, demanding weeks of haymaking and the first days of summer, and to the wider yearly rhythm that shapes this entire village's life beyond any single day. Asterisk.